Okay, ready? I'm going to start. So good afternoon, everybody. President Cicuto, the mayor and deputy mayors of Venice, Barcelona, Bogota, and Naples, esteemed panelists, moderators, and guests. Thank you for joining us for the 5th event in the summer Carnival program. 2 years ago, when I began thinking about the kinds of discussions that I would like to stage in the Meetings on Architecture program that is an integral part of the exhibition, the word carnival kept popping or appearing in my mind's eye. When you think of a carnival, or at least when I think about carnivals, I think of London's Notting Hill Carnival or Rio or the Caribbean. Festive occasions that have very little to do with the formal panel discussions that are held in places like this, particularly during major exhibitions. But I'm inspired by the Russian literary critic Bakhtin's reading of the Carnival as a second life, a place of free interaction between the unlikeliest of people, where hierarchies are suspended and boundaries, particularly disciplinary boundaries, are dissolved. Today's event brings speakers together from a very wide spectrum of disciplines, probably the widest range in the entire Carnival program. The politicians, city officials, academics, architects, sociologists, economists, and urbanists on the panel are, to my mind, connected not so much through subject matter or even areas of expertise, but rather a commitment to two things: innovation and action. This sharing of perspectives is sadly quite unique. The opportunity for dialogue the Council offers its members and guests is unlike any I have ever come across. There are several standard complaints that circulate amongst built environment professionals. We are too insular, too siloed, too parochial, and too wrapped up in our own disciplinary boundaries to come up with solutions. It is more complex than that, of course, but the truth of the matter is that the opportunities to think laterally across areas that are of interest but not expertise are depressingly rare. I can pick up a book on pretty much any subject under the sun, but the quick-fire, quick-witted, and urgent exchange of ideas that happens when members come together, whether digitally or in person, is a different experience altogether. Sitting across the table or the screen from figures in the worlds of policy, economics, city governance, parastatal agencies, seeing where and how ideas diverge or intersect isn't something that one can do every day. The experience, at least for me, is too intense, and I find I need time and space to process what I have heard in order to synthesize it with my own views and experiences, at least in a disciplinary sense. But the Council meetings also serve as a reminder that if dialogue is twinned with action, whether in the form of a white paper, a publication, or a policy change, then ideas have the opportunity to go beyond the imagined and the imaginary and to find a foot or place in the world. And it is this aspect of being in the world, not simply of it, that characterizes discussions about cities. To find an economist as passionately invested in action as a mayor or a sociologist who understands the potency of design is precisely the kind of interpersonal, interdisciplinary approach that must underpin our short and long-term efforts to steer us towards cohesion, not fragmentation, as Mayor Claudia Lopez put it to me yesterday, since fragmentation is the breeding swamp for inequity of all kinds, social as well as environmental. As with any group of opinionated and committed participants, it took some time to settle on the agenda and direction of today's discussion. The two panels are of course interconnected, but their differing emphases on governance and education point to the twin poles of discussion and action that we began with. To think, to do. Impossible to have one without the other. So please join me in welcoming the esteemed and engaging group of actors in the best sense of the word to the stage. President Cicuto, thank you.
Ok, good afternoon, buongiorno. Penso che posso parlare italiano e c'è traduzione simultanea? Ok. C'è una ragione principale per la mia presenza qui oggi ed è quella di cercare di essere perdonato da Lesley, perché credo che sia stata un'esperienza straordinaria, ma al tempo stesso l'ho vista ridotta in termini proprio fisici e psicologici duri da superare. Solo il coraggio e la determinazione l'hanno portata a fare qualcosa di inedito, non solo dal punto di vista della curatela di architettura, della Mostra Internazionale di Architettura, ma soprattutto per aver accettato di inventarsi un nuovo college di architettura per essere alla pari con le altre discipline della Biennale, solo che mentre gli altri producono spettacoli teatrali, coreografie di danza, film, degli oggetti concreti e visibili, lei, come tutta la sua mostra, si è cimentata con la grande domanda: come trasmettere, insegnare, capire e far capire agli altri che cosa significa architettura. Quindi da una cosa così fisica, così precisa come è il costruire le case, lei ha spostato il punto di vista sull'immateriale. E questo immateriale è la ragione per cui io ho pensato di chiedere a Lesley di curare una mostra di architettura, perché da ex uomo di cinema penso che ci sia sempre bisogno di un controcampo, che si faccia una ripresa prendendo un primo piano, ma che poi si possa vedere che cosa quel primo piano sta guardando. E questo l'abbiamo fatto sia da un punto di vista di scelta geografica. Il suo laboratorio di partenza è il continente africano, che si confronta con il resto del mondo, sia dal punto di vista, secondo me, proprio del vedere. Cioè noi spesso, pigramente, crediamo di sapere che cosa si vede stando da un'altra parte, sia da un punto di vista geografico che politico che culturale, ma non è vero. Quindi io credo che lei abbia dato voce a qualcosa a cui noi non eravamo abituati. Ha richiesto fatica anche agli spettatori, ma chiunque l'abbia vissuta cercando di approfondire quello che vedeva ne è uscito arricchito. Per venire al tema, diciamo, di questa prima parte del convegno, approfitto della presenza del sindaco Brugnaro, perché io penso che in questa città ci sia un esempio straordinario di influenza della cultura nella vita quotidiana e nel funzionamento di una città e anche nella creazione di valore economico. Siamo all'Arsenale, conoscete i giardini, forse conoscete anche gli edifici del Lido dove si svolge in questi giorni la mostra del cinema e molti territori che sono stati riqualificati nell'entroterra, Forte Marghera, Mestre, Parco della Bissuola e molti altri. Tutti questi territori sono stati riqualificati, bonificati, consolidati grazie ad un progetto culturale. Che ci sia un luogo della città storico e importante come l'Arsenale, che per forse secoli è stato abbandonato se non riattivato in occasione delle guerre del secolo scorso, dedicato a delle iniziative culturali che non sono concepite solo ed esclusivamente per chi viene a visitarlo, per gli addetti ai lavori, ma sono concepite come strumento di sviluppo e di conoscenza per la città e anche per i non residenti in città, ovviamente, è a mio avviso un esempio molto virtuoso di come un'istituzione come la Biennale, su luoghi che non le appartengono, messi a disposizione dell'amministrazione cittadina e dalle autorità politiche, possa svolgere un lavoro che non è solo quello, diciamo, di permettere la crescita culturale, ma anche di preservare luoghi che altrimenti non troverebbero le sostanze per essere vissuti. Allora io credo che Venezia, con tutta la difficoltà di uno dei luoghi più fragili, più straordinari, più storici del mondo, che si confronta con molti dei problemi che altre grandi città, soprattutto città storiche, fanno, debba veramente trovare la capacità di ovviamente dialogo, ma di cercare di capire le ragioni di base per cui non ci possono essere visioni manichee in cui certi luoghi possono vivere solo se adibiti a qualche cosa che magari ha anche un senso forte nella tradizione dei mestieri nati in questa città, ma che con essi non sopravviverebbero e che grazie al fatto che oggi un progetto culturale come quello della Biennale porta risorse e convince la politica, perché questo è successo soprattutto dopo il Covid, a fare con fondi europei e con fondi invece governativi e con fondi locali un'opera di consolidamento e restituzione di questi luoghi alla vita, è, forse ho schematizzato troppo, un esempio molto virtuoso. Non voglio portare via tempo, penso che sia un pomeriggio importante, grazie ancora a Lesley, ti prego perdonami, penso che quando sarà tutto finito avremo modo di capire quanto è stato importante il tuo apporto in questa istituzione e nel mondo non solo dell'architettura. Ringrazio tutti i convenuti, benvenuti a Venezia e credo di dar la parola al sindaco Luigi Brugnaro, rappresentante di questa città e non solo della città metropolitana, così complessa, ricca di storia e di possibilità. Grazie.
Sì, buonasera a tutti. Io porgo i saluti della città a questo convegno, a questo gruppo di lavoro e anch'io voglio ringraziare Lesley Lokko perché credo abbia dato una grande sferzata di energia all'idea della Biennale di Architettura di quest'anno. Per cui complimenti, io sono stato a vedermela per conto mio riservatamente così. Mi è piaciuto perché ci sono molti temi aperti da sviluppare sicuramente, soprattutto l'idea della contaminazione. Mi è piaciuto molto il riferimento alla parcellizzazione, che è effettivamente uno dei grandi problemi della programmazione. Cioè se noi affrontiamo i problemi separatamente e poi dobbiamo farlo nell'azione operativa, rischiamo di perdere di vista una visione d'insieme e noi dobbiamo riuscire a tenere insieme la vita delle persone, tutte le persone, non soltanto appunto la parcellizzazione dei singoli problemi, e questa è la parte più difficile. Allora vi confesso che per me la Biennale di Architettura è molto importante da sempre perché io sono laureato in architettura, proprio qui a Venezia allo UCL, e una delle poche cose che ho imparato quando mi sono laureato è l'idea che l'architetto, come lo intendo io, cioè l'idea dell'architetto, sia una visione molto più ampia che non il semplice professionista dell'edilizia o dell'urbanistica. Pensate all'idea che aveva Brunelleschi dell'architettura. Lui era sì un grande architetto, ovviamente una persona che aveva l'idea delle proporzioni, della bellezza, eccetera, ma era anche un grande costruttore, un grande innovatore anche in senso proprio ingegneristico, perché era un grande ingegnere, ma poi era anche un economo, era quello che faceva il direttore di lavori in cantiere, si occupava dei soldi che servivano per costruire quegli edifici. Per cui era costretto a interfacciarsi con la committenza e con, fra virgolette, i clienti. Cosa voglio dire? Voglio dire che ci sono diverse visioni proprio ideologiche del mondo, indubbiamente, tutte rispettabili. Io personalmente credo che dobbiamo imparare in Italia ad aprire con molta fiducia il rapporto col privato. Il privato non deve essere demonizzato pensando che questo per forza debba portare con sé degli interessi occulti o contrari al pubblico interesse, ma tutt'altro. Dobbiamo pensare, come è scritto anche nella Costituzione italiana, al ruolo della sussidiarietà, cioè l'intervento pubblico deve essere sicuramente incisivo, sicuramente forte nel momento in cui riesce anche a collegare tanti interessi privati. C'è una città, e Venezia ha bisogno di questo, deve essere una città viva, se no diventa appunto una città museo, non è quello che tutti vogliamo, questo lo diciamo più volte. Come anche certi problemi che sono storici in questa città, per esempio il moto ondoso che di questi giorni è anche di attualità. È assolutamente vero che è un problema, ma dobbiamo andare, una volta che abbiamo definito che è un problema e vogliamo risolverlo, dobbiamo andare alle ragioni profonde, quelle reali, concrete, del perché non si risolve, perché se tu non fai una buona analisi di un progetto, non puoi fare un progetto. Io questo ho imparato all'università. L'analisi è fondamentale e l'analisi dice in maniera impietosa che in questa città si sono frammentate le competenze, si sono frammentate le autorità, e per agire su un sistema che è unico a Venezia, dove è un'altra città che vive sull'acqua, per farlo ci sono bisogno di legislazioni nazionali che contemplino questo. Per cui, per quanto vuoi, tu non puoi applicare certe tue volontà, certe volontà sociali locali, se non hai un contesto nazionale di leggi. Ecco, con tutti i governi passati, non queste cose richieste più volte, queste diciamo, autorizzazioni, queste leggi specifiche non sono arrivate. Adesso, parlando del moto ondoso, ci sono molti modi di affrontare le cose, no? C'è il modo, diciamo, urlato. Spesso bisogna riuscire a scindere chi urla con ragione, perché sta protestando legittimamente, questo è un esercizio importante, democratico, da chi invece strumentalizza quella protesta, magari anche legittimamente ai fini personali, ai fini di visibilità personale, ai fini di visibilità politica. Questo crea un disturbo nella soluzione del problema. Perché noi invece dobbiamo credere davvero nella democrazia, dobbiamo credere anche uno nell'altro, con rispetto, a prescindere dalle idee che possiamo portare reciprocamente. Con grande rispetto dobbiamo riconoscere che ci sono idee diverse, ma in quel momento, per quello la democrazia, quando si va a votare, si decide una strada. E quella strada dovrebbe essere sostenuta il più possibile per arrivare all'obiettivo. Ecco, a Venezia abbiamo fatto tante cose, il Presidente, io voglio ringraziarlo, salutarlo e ringraziarlo perché è una persona coraggiosa. È una persona coraggiosa che spesso è andato controcorrente e oggi ha detto delle cose anche sinteticamente molto importanti. Ha raccontato di cose che abbiamo fatto. Dico abbiamo perché l'istituzione della Biennale è sicuramente fondamentale per la città, non lo abbiamo scoperto oggi ovviamente, ha dei numeri incredibili ma anche in termini proprio di rapporti culturali fra di noi, non numeri solo di visitatori della Biennale. Noi abbiamo affrontato insieme il periodo della pandemia dove non c'era nessuno, dove sembrava che tutto dovesse morire, che il mondo potesse morire. C'era chi lavorava anche su questo. Noi abbiamo tenuto duro e abbiamo in quel periodo l'abbiamo utilizzato per ristrutturare, ragionare, ripensare, per essere pronti a un nuovo futuro. Questo nuovo futuro è davanti a noi, dobbiamo farlo per i bambini, per i ragazzini piccoli che tra l'altro non vanno a votare. Allora, qual è la concretezza delle cose? È aver alzato il Mose, è aver risolto, stiamo facendo lavori sulle rive a Venezia, abbiamo deviato, abbiamo spostato le navi, non passano più per San Marco, cose, parlo di problemi per carità legati a Venezia ma molto concreti. Stiamo assieme all'autorità portuale costruendo la marittima a Marghera, c'è il tema dei canali, noi abbiamo delle incrostazioni vecchie, non vi tedio sulle cose tecniche, però dove mancavano, per esempio mancava, adesso è stata approvata per fortuna qualche mese fa, il protocollo fanghi, che a voi dirà poco, ma che è importantissimo per poter pulire i canali. A Venezia dobbiamo pulire il limo dei canali, cioè l'acqua di Venezia deposita sul fondo il limo che arriva ancora dai canali della laguna. E questo era uno dei grandi problemi di Venezia, l'interramento delle acque. Qualcuno anche su questo riesce a dire cose non esatte, la dico così per dirla semplice, per prenderla proprio leggera. E allora noi invece dobbiamo pulire i canali, perché se non pulisci i canali, le barche, racconto solo le ambulanze e i vigili del fuoco, ma per non parlare delle barche normali delle persone, rischiano di non passare più in momenti di bassa marea, perché è un tema di sicurezza della città. La città deve modernizzarsi e lo sta facendo. Durante il Covid abbiamo realizzato, costruito, scavato e finito una grande vasca di laminazione a Mestre, che impedirà diciamo, l'allagamento della città in occasione di questi effetti dei cambiamenti climatici che ci sono. Chi è che può negare una roba del genere? È evidente davanti a tutti. Il tema è: continuiamo a dircelo o agiamo? E lo dico a dei tecnici, poi ci sono tanti modi di agire, però la laminazione delle acque ormai è una cosa abbastanza riconosciuta, l'abbiamo visto in Emilia Romagna. Ecco, a Mestre l'abbiamo fatto, stiamo facendo una seconda vasca, parlo di vasche gigantesche, immaginatevi 4 volte questa sala per farvi capire, non si vede nulla. Abbiamo ristrutturato un forte a Mestre, si chiama Forte Marghera, era un forte importantissimo per la città di Venezia, tra l'altro, che invito tutti a vedere perché era un baluardo di difesa della città dalla terra, perché Venezia non è solo stato del mar, era stato del mar e stato de terra, era uno stato Venezia, perché qui siamo nel luogo, tra l'altro nel luogo militare della città, San Marco il luogo politico, Rialto il luogo commerciale, dove il soft power, quello che state facendo voi oggi è soft power, vuol dire il potere tranquillo, il potere della discussione, il potere del ragionamento, possibilmente con rispetto, perché vi auguro buon lavoro, ho piacere che la Biennale abbia avuto questa grande idea, ancora grazie a LSE davvero, e buon lavoro a tutti, chissà che poi questa cosa produca più unità di intenti per risolvere le cose. Grazie.
Buonasera a tutti, adesso cominciamo questo panel e volevo soprattutto ringraziare Lesley Lokko per averci portato assieme, ma anche per essere membra del Council che oggi vedete una parte, tutte queste donne fantastiche che per me è un onore poter stimolare attraverso questa conversazione, ma grazie di nuovo Lesley per questa tua visione che hai portato a questa Biennale di cui tutti nel mondo stanno parlando, di come ha aiutato a pensare in modo diverso. E questo in effetti è il punto di questo panel che si chiama Governing Urban Futures, Financing, Negotiating Urban Transformations. Governare un futuro, finanziare un futuro, negoziare un futuro, per cosa? Una trasformazione. E abbiamo appena sentito diverse cose che si possono fare in una città o anche in un paese, siamo in Italia. L'Italia, come molti stati in questo momento in Europa, stanno anche avendo il beneficio di fondi che vengono dall'Europa, ma quando questi fondi arrivano, quando cadono sulle pubbliche amministrazioni a livello di città, di regione o di Stato, se non abbiamo investito nel fare in modo diverso, il problema è che il futuro che poi si crea è il futuro vecchio. E quello che si è detto durante Covid, che bisognava build back better, no? In realtà è build forwards better. Dobbiamo veramente creare un futuro diverso, dato che il tipo di crescita che abbiamo avuto negli ultimi 50-100 anni ci hanno portato un tipo di crescita, una direzione a quella crescita problematica. Abbiamo un problema climatico che oramai è a un livello così pericoloso che quasi non possiamo più tornare indietro, e quindi questa urgenza è immediata. Abbiamo visto che con Covid non avevamo investito abbastanza nei sistemi sanitari, ma anche le persone che lavorano in quei sistemi. E ovviamente abbiamo anche una crisi finanziaria che continua, se guardiamo per esempio il livello di debito privato, spesso si parla di debito pubblico, ma il livello di debito privato, che è quello che ci ha portato alla crisi finanziaria, è di nuovo ad altissimi livelli. E quindi quello che ci interessa qua, no, è parlare di come fare, ma non solo come propaganda, abbiamo fatto questo, abbiamo fatto quello, guarda tutto quello che abbiamo fatto in queste città diverse e nazioni diverse di cui sentiremo oggi, ma soprattutto qual era il pensiero diverso che uno ha portato in quel fare trasformativo. E se parliamo del settore privato, che è assolutamente importante, e sono contenta che l'abbiamo appena sentito, il modo di lavorare assieme il pubblico e il privato per trasformare una società invece di solo ricevere sussidi, garanzia per rimanere fermi, quindi avere un tipo di reciprocità, parlo malissimo l'italiano, scusate, reciprocity, e creare una partnership simbiotico invece di un partnership parasitico, sarà molto, molto, molto importante per il futuro, e quello che noi vogliamo fare qua, in questa sessione, sto per introdurre queste donne veramente visionarie che hanno gestito questi problemi al loro livello di città, ma anche di regione, anche come la ministra di housing, come si dice housing in italiano? Oddio. De vivienda? No, quello è spagnolo. Della casa. Cioè, vabbè, arriveremo in un secondo alle introduzioni, è molto importante, no? John Maynard Keynes, uno dei grandi economisti, diceva che chi lavora sui problemi, i practitioners, i praticanti, spesso fanno, ma sono anche spesso servi di un'economia vecchia, la stessa economia che poi porta a quei problemi che poi uno cerca di risolvere. Quindi vorrei che in qualche modo questa conversazione sia una conversazione che continua in tutti gli interventi, anche la discussione che avremo assieme, che mette in relazione questo nuovo tipo di politica economica e di pensiero su come fare e su quello che si è fatto. Le storie, ma anche i bottlenecks, le barriere, perché poi anche quando uno fa, se non riusciamo a raccontare le storie di quello che si è fatto, ma anche di valutare quello che è stato fatto, magari poi non riviene rifatto. E oggi, durante il nostro meeting del Council, Dan Hill, che è qua, ha detto che bisogna ricordarsi che anche solo la parola ricerca, research, viene dal fatto che quando uno cerca, search, poi deve rifarlo per capire. Quindi cercare, ricercare di nuovo e imparare. E questo council si chiama Council on Urban Initiatives, che abbiamo molto dibattuto con Ricky, che è il co-chair di questo council, come chiamarlo, ma la parola iniziativa è importante perché si deve sperimentare, bisogna provare, ma poi bisogna anche imparare le lezioni di quello che si è provato per farlo meglio dopo. E quindi adesso con quello vorrei introdurre queste donne fantastiche. Abbiamo Ada Colau, che era la sindaca di Barcellona dal 2015 al 2023, e in questo momento è un council member di Barcellona City Council. Abbiamo Claudia Lopez, che è attualmente la sindaca di Bogotà e che prima era una senatrice per la Repubblica della Colombia dal 2014 al 2019. Abbiamo Laura Lieto, che è la sindaca deputy, non so come si può, è scritto in inglese, sto parlando in italiano, comunque la vice sindaca di Napoli e consigliera per la pianificazione urbana, ma anche professoressa di urban planning alla Federico II Università. E abbiamo Soledad Núñez, che era prima la ministra della Casa e del Habitat del Paraguay, ma anche la candidata alla vicepresidenza del paese recentemente. E quello che vorremmo fare è pensare a 3 domande e lascerò molto aperto a come volete, diciamo, rispondere a questa prima domanda. Di pensare a momenti nel vostro leadership, della vostra visione, ma anche quello che avete fatto, che in qualche modo ha portato assieme 3 cose. 1, un outcomes orientation, purpose orientation, che è quello che come sindaca o come ministra avete fatto, era di avere un problema che bisognava risolvere e di poi usare tutti gli strumenti, dal modo che uno fa gli appalti, al budgeting, mirata a quel problema, invece no, di solo distribuire fondi qua e là, e soprattutto come poi catalizzare il modo che tutti hanno lavorato assieme intorno a quel problema. E volevamo cominciare la discussione sul problema della casa, la casa per tutti, non solo la casa come una struttura, no? E comincerò con Ada, perché Ada, la cosa molto interessante di Ada è che prima di diventare sindaca era capa, diciamo, di un movimento intorno alla casa per tutti, quindi anche quella relazione con i movimenti sociali è molto importante. 2, la finanza, in un momento dove tutti i paesi oggi, molti paesi, non abbastanza, ma molti paesi stanno cercando un recovery plan, un piano di ricoverare un'economia che non funziona più. Quando arrivano i soldi e la finanza, come si struttura questa finanza, invece solo di pensare ai soldi, no, come un medium of exchange. La struttura della finanza può essere una finanza pubblica, attraverso una banca pubblica, ma anche proprio il modo che si finanzia attraverso un outcomes orientation. E terzo, questo problema che so è molto caro a Claudia, sul partnership. Come si lavora veramente in un modo simbiotico? Cosa vuol dire sui contratti? I contratti che possono essere letteralmente il contratto di un prestito, un contratto di un appalto, ma il contratto come momento dove si può veramente strutturare un partnership fra pubblico, privato, ma anche il settore, il third sector, su lavorare verso una meta, quella che nel nostro council chiamiamo missions, le missioni. Andare sulla Luna sarebbe impossibile se la NASA non lavorava assieme in modo simbiotico con tutte le industrie diverse, non solo quello dell'aerospace. Quindi comincerò con te, Ada, perché so che questo problema della casa pubblica, il social housing, è stato importantissimo anche prima che sei diventata sindaca, e se tutti voi 4, nel modo che volete riflettere su qualcosa che avete fatto a livello della città, ma soprattutto le lezioni che avete poi ottenuto da quello, su come fare in modo diverso, ma anche i problemi, le barriere, i bottlenecks. Grazie.
Okay. Beh, anch'io voglio ringraziarvi, Mariana, responsabile di questa Biennale, al sindaco anche per darci il benvenuto e ospitarci in questa città bellissima e meravigliosa. Sono molto felice di essere qui con queste donne straordinarie, poi un panel di tutto donne, che ancora adesso non capita spesso, quindi molto felice. Io pensavo, prima quando sentivo al sindaco, perché Barcellona condivide con Venezia alcune sfide, no? E per esempio la gestione del turismo chiaramente è una di queste sfide, anche con Amsterdam e tante altre città europee. E una delle prime cose che noi abbiamo fatto quando siamo arrivati al comune 8 anni fa, no? Sono diventata sindaca 8 anni fa, e il problema principale che si sentiva in città nella maggior parte dei quartieri delle persone è: stiamo perdendo la nostra città, stiamo perdendo i quartieri e la città mi manda via. No, Barcellona non mi vuole più, Barcellona mi manda via perché il turismo lo riempie tutto, il business lo riempie tutto, no? Le banche hanno centinaia, migliaia di case dopo la crisi finanziaria, eccetera, eccetera, quindi la speculazione non ha limiti e tutti noi sappiamo, no, che in questa globalizzazione ci sono cose buone della globalizzazione, però ce ne sono altre che no, non funzionano bene per il bene comune. E una è proprio questa, che i grandi capitali, i grandi fondi arrivano nelle nostre città, comprano migliaia di appartamenti, di suolo, non per vivere, ma per speculare soltanto, no? A volte solo per rivendere e non sono corresponsabili di cosa succede con quella proprietà, no? A differenza dei piccoli proprietari, che secondo me è una cosa importante distinguere il piccolo proprietario dal grande proprietario, no? Perché secondo me devono avere responsabilità sociali diverse. Comunque noi abbiamo trovato questo conflitto nella città dove la cittadinanza si sentiva, i cittadini di Barcellona si sentivano proprio così mandati via in tensione, e in particolare con il turismo che non solo già nel centro storico ma in generale in città c'erano migliaia di appartamenti turistici legali ma anche illegali, perché è un modo di avere un reddito veloce molto più alto che affittare la casa a un locale, no? E non c'era nessuna regolazione, nessun controllo, e questo libero mercato aveva creato questa tensione senza nessuna leadership pubblica, no? Senza una visione dal pubblico, senza un modello di città che avesse una proposta per riequilibrare queste attività. E noi all'inizio, appena arrivati, abbiamo detto qui bisogna regolare, scusate, cioè anche per difendere un libero mercato che funzioni bene bisogna regolare, perché adesso è il caos. E quindi abbiamo creato una nuova istituzione dentro dell'istituzione che non esisteva, abbiamo chiuso migliaia di appartamenti turistici illegali, abbiamo anche confrontato poteri globali potenti come possono essere queste piattaforme come Airbnb ed altri simili. Siamo riusciti a chiudere più di 6.000 appartamenti illegali, ma non solo questo, siamo riusciti a fare che la maggior parte di questi appartamenti tornassero al mercato per residenti, che era l'obiettivo, no? L'obiettivo non era semplicemente chiudere un appartamento turistico, ma fare che questi appartamenti fossero per vivere in città. All'inizio, quando abbiamo iniziato questa regolazione, tutti in città, ma soprattutto il mondo, diciamo, delle grandi aziende legate al turismo, ci dicevano che stavamo per ammazzare l'economia della città, che stavamo per creare migliaia di persone senza lavoro, eccetera. È successo il contrario. E noi lo dicevamo, non è solo una questione per difendere il diritto alla casa, non è solo una questione per evitare i conflitti nei quartieri massificati dal turismo, ma è anche per difendere l'economia della nostra città. Un'eccessiva dipendenza dal turismo ci rende più vulnerabili, più fragili. E questo la pandemia l'ha confermato chiaramente, no? E poi Barcellona deve fidarsi delle proprie possibilità. Abbiamo delle università di primo livello, siamo un riferimento in architettura, urbanismo, cultura, educazione, tecnologia. Quindi abbiamo tante potenzialità, no? E quindi bisognava diversificare di più questa economia e non avere questa forte dipendenza che noi abbiamo trovato dal real estate, dall'immobiliare e dal turismo. Insisto, abbiamo iniziato a regolare, ci hanno detto che eravamo i comunisti che fermavano l'economia. Oggi c'è più lavoro a Barcellona, l'economia in tutti gli indicatori sono migliorati e adesso sono anche le aziende dei grandi alberghi che difendono la regolazione che abbiamo fatto e lo mettono come esempio in altre città. Quindi siamo riusciti a fare una certa pedagogia e finalmente ad avere lo stesso obiettivo, no? Però non è stato semplice, perché quando tu tocchi degli interessi economici di un potere che non è abituato che nessuno gli dica verso dove vogliamo andare come città, come paese, no? E che bisogna avere una pianificazione non solo nel breve termine ma nel lungo periodo, e qui tocchi interessi e per esempio nel nostro caso, nel nostro comune, a me mi hanno fatto causa nei tribunali più di 10 volte, poi sempre finisce in nulla, però cercano anche in un modo molto aggressivo, no? Con delle campagne di fake news, con i tribunali, di fermare questi interventi per regolare. Poi, al di là del turismo, con housing policies, noi abbiamo fatto tante cose che ci dicevano che erano impossibili. Quando io ero l'attivista di movimento sociale e andavo al comune, no? Bussavo alla porta e dicevo: ma guarda che in Europa, nel nord Europa, ci sono tante altre cose che si fanno, no? Ci sono regolazioni, ma ci sono anche costruzioni industriali per fare una costruzione molto più veloce che quella tradizionale, con container marittimi riciclati, e ci dicevano: ma tu sei matta, ma questo che cos'è? Oggi è una realtà che riceve tanti premi internazionali e che in 6 mesi siamo riusciti a fare dei palazzi interi di un'altissima qualità. O quando dicevamo bisogna fare le cooperative prestando il suolo municipale pubblico senza dare la proprietà, no? Solo l'uso, e così coinvolgiamo a tanti agenti cittadini che possono costruire, perché il comune non può costruire tutto, è impossibile costruire tutta la casa che abbiamo bisogno, no? Quindi abbiamo bisogno di tanto partnership, quindi abbiamo cercato di tutto, no? Per esempio le cooperative che oggi fanno più di 1000 appartamenti in questo regime, e anche di pubblico privato, no? Prima si parlava di non demonizzare il privato, assolutamente d'accordo, non bisogna demonizzare il privato, però bisogna, come diceva bene Mariana, no? Di ridefinire questo rapporto, perché noi quello che abbiamo incontrato è che il privato faceva quel che voleva in città e il pubblico non diceva nulla, no? Anzi aiutava i grandi e non aiutava i vicini che poi subivano le conseguenze di quelle politiche nel breve periodo, no? E quindi abbiamo innovato anche in questo, in nuovi rapporti nella scala metropolitana, anche perché abbiamo bisogno di avere uno sguardo più largo, no? Non solo nel municipio, che Barcellona è una città densa e piccola e quindi abbiamo bisogno dello sguardo metropolitano, e abbiamo creato una cosa che non esisteva, che era un'azienda pubblico-privata dove il pubblico fa questo prestito di suolo e le aziende che vincono un concorso pubblico costruiscono e gestiscono un affitto che non è né sociale né libero mercato, è a metà, no? E quindi del sociale se ne occupa il pubblico soprattutto, ma poi con il privato lavoriamo per fare prezzi ragionevoli. O abbiamo per esempio creato un altro servizio che non esisteva, dove noi aiutiamo i piccoli proprietari che hanno paura di affittare perché magari arriva uno che distrugge l'appartamento perché non paga l'affitto. Il comune dice: se tu metti un affitto ragionevole noi ti aiutiamo, ti diamo i soldi per ristrutturare l'appartamento, ti diamo anche la sicurezza che tu avrai l'affitto anche se la persona non può pagare, e noi ci occuperemo, no, di gestire questa situazione. Quindi abbiamo innovato in tanti sensi con la politica abitativa, facendo tante cose che ci dicevano che erano impossibili. E quindi secondo me questo è interessante, perché è vero che nel municipio, nel locale, non abbiamo il budget che hanno i governi regionali e statali, che hanno quasi tutti i soldi loro, cioè in Spagna tra l'11 e il 13% del totale dei soldi pubblici li gestiscono gli enti locali, quindi la parte più piccola. Abbiamo pochi soldi, però siamo noi che dobbiamo rispondere ai cittadini ogni giorno, perché i ministri non stanno lì per strada ogni giorno, invece i sindaci sì, e quindi bisogna rispondere, e siamo più creativi e cooperiamo anche tra le città, no? Tra il network di città, che ci aiutiamo con delle idee e l'immaginazione e la creatività per cercare soluzioni innovative. E secondo me questo serve no? per anche ispirare, dire, quando uno Stato ti dice questo non si può fare, beh, se la città nella piccola scala l'ha fatto, vuol dire che lo Stato, che ha più potere sia legale di intervento nelle leggi come nel finanziamento, lo può fare, quindi hai un caso che ti serve a convincere lo Stato, no? E questo per esempio è capitato con gli appartamenti turistici. Siamo stati la prima città a confrontare Airbnb, a chiudere questi appartamenti turistici illegali. Altre città poi sono venute a imparare quello che avevamo fatto, ci siamo messi assieme in una rete anche per forzare Airbnb a cambiare la politica che aveva nelle nostre città, e finalmente adesso per esempio stati come il Portogallo poco tempo fa ha fatto una legge per dire basta appartamenti turistici, perché abbiamo bisogno che le città, le case siano per vivere. E quindi c'è stato questo salto di scala che secondo me è una delle sfide che abbiamo sempre le città, che le città possiamo trovare le risorse, facciamo il partnership creativo, troviamo le nuove idee, le scambiamo, cerchiamo di fare molto con poche risorse, però poi sempre trovi il bisogno del salto di scala. Il salto di scala lo devi fare con gli stati, agli stati bisogna convincerli, no? E lì abbiamo una difficoltà ancora da risolvere perché è molto lento e si fa troppa fatica. E poi un'altra cosa che lascerei così come sul tavolo, diciamo, del dibattito, credo che tra le grandi regole delle Nazioni Unite, delle Costituzioni, eccetera, e poi la realtà locale, no, e le politiche pubbliche locali, ci vuole in certi argomenti che sono di interesse generale, che riguardano tutti, come la gestione dell'energia in un momento di emergenza climatica, come la gestione del housing, che è un diritto fondamentale perché tutti abbiamo bisogno di una casa, altrimenti non esiste il diritto alla città. Cose importanti, acqua, energia, housing, hanno bisogno, al di là delle costituzioni e i riconoscimenti internazionali dei diritti umani, di un certo accordo, un nuovo patto, qualche accordo internazionale per une regole minime in cui ci siano i minimi che bisogna rispettare per fare sì che le case siano per vivere prima che per speculare o per fare altro. No? Lascio qui.
Grazie Ada. Dopo torneremo a questo tema perché veramente il filo conduttore spero che sia uno sul come fare pubblico-privato sia a livello di un'azienda, che può dentro dell'azienda essere pubblico-privato, ma anche a livello del contratto. Una volta mi hai detto che il modo che tu misuri il tuo successo è quante cause ti fanno. Come hai detto, credo che erano 11 cause, non solo 10. Allora, ci muoviamo verso Claudia Lopez, la sindaca attuale del Bogotà. Una grande eroe fra tanti sindaci perché sta facendo delle cose pazzesche. Adesso mi muovo nell'inglese. If you can tell us both about what you've done around housing, which you've recently written about, but also the care blocks, looking at blocks and neighborhoods as centerpieces where care, social care, good livelihoods, good homes are thought about together in a holistic way, as opposed to thinking about them separate, which by definition needs an all-of-government approach. This is a city government, which to do what you've done has had to think interministerially, interdepartmentally, instead of seeing housing as a deep dive, just little rabbit.
Well, thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here in this panel and this city and the Biennale. And thanks to Lesley for allowing us to be here sharing this discussion. So let me start just with a little bit of context. I'm the mayor of Bogotá. Bogotá is the capital of Colombia. Colombia is more than 50 million people. Bogotá is 8 million people. It's part of a metropolitan region of 11 million people. And regarding housing and caring, I'm the first woman to be elected mayor in Bogotá. We held popular elections since 1988. And I'm the daughter of a teacher. I'm a lesbian woman. And so I had to do something meaningful, really meaningful for a woman who was very supportive of my election, who are 52% of the population of Bogotá. So the other important context piece of information here is, in Colombia, almost 60% of the employment is informal. More than 50% of the housing stock is informal. Informal meaning out of the range of the formal urban planning. These are housing built by their families, brick by brick, peso by peso. It's like in the formal economy, we have bank accounts. Well, people in the informal economy, the bank account is their home. Every brick, every new room, every new bedroom, that's a bank account. Their savings of the entire family are put there, brick by brick. They, came from rough materials to better materials, and they push back politically and socially so that usually the city planning officer is able to recognize them as part of the city. And hopefully, 2 decades after, the entire neighborhood gets legalized. And legalized means they can achieve clean water, energy, sanitation, and that's pretty much it. And hopefully, some roads and stuff. So that was the usual way to go. So what we're trying to change from that is, first of all, we have the great opportunity during my term. We have pains, such as the pandemic, but we also have opportunities that in my term I could upgrade the sort of land zoning master urban plan of the city, which was not updated for 17 years because of political fighting, basically. No mayor was able to convince the city council to upgrade the master urban plan and zoning plan of the city. So that was one opportunity. The second opportunity was after fighting almost for 20 years about whether to do or not to do a metro, which is just a stupid discussion, because of course we need multimodal transportation as any other city. Finally, the first metro line started. So now we're building the first metro line and sort of going from a Transmilenio, which is a BRT system, bus-based rapid transit exclusive lanes system, into cables and bikes and pedestrian spaces, electric buses, and the metro. It's a multimodal system. So that was the second opportunity we have. And the third opportunity actually was the pandemic. Now, suddenly, unemployment went from 10% to 30% in a year. And poverty was from 15% to 40%, which is a huge social crisis. So which we offered the city, the deal was, let's build a new green social contract for Bogota. Because otherwise, we're not gonna only lose employment and jobs. We're gonna have a level of social unrest that will kill our democracy. So let's think thoroughly, invest justly and greenly, so that we can recover the employment, but not in any way, but in a way that is more inclusive for everyone, particularly for women and for young generations. So that was my purpose. That was my offer to the private sector, to the council, to the national government. Really, we're not about to lose employment, we're about to lose our democracy because of this level of social unrest. So the proposal was, look, let's include this thing that you keep calling the informal housing, the informal settlement, something that is sort of not desirable. You cannot tell a third of your city that they are not desirable, that somehow they shouldn't be there, but we have to recognize that they are there. You cannot address a third of your population in this way. It's unrespectful, it's undesirable, it's not productive, it creates resentment. Let's do a master urban development plan and welcome them to the city and offer them not only water and electricity, which is just the minimum, but the social infrastructure that they need. Not only that they need to pave the roads, which of course they need, but let's offer them, they have maybe one park there, one school there, maybe a kindergarten, maybe a good school, but they are not interconnected. Not physically, from the urban point of view, try to connect them so that taking care of pedestrians and allowing the kids going safely by biking to the schools, and use all that social infrastructure, which have been thought only for kids, for they to educate, for they to have fun, for they to have sports. And their mothers are just, in the seats. And nobody is for them, for the mothers, for the caregivers. So let me tell you this. Out of the 8 million people of Bogota, 4.5 million people are women. And 1 million, a little bit more than 1 million women are just caregivers women. They sacrifice their education, their labor opportunities, their income, their own health, just to take care of the other members of their family, either their kids or their elders, or maybe the members of their family who have disabilities. So why? Because they are the social security of the informal economy. If you have an informal economy, it means you don't have a minimum wage, a decent living wage. You don't have a pension fund. You don't have a health insurance. But at some point in your life, you may get sick. At some point of your life, you may be a kid, and at some point of your life, you grow and you're an elder person, and you need care. Who's providing that care if you don't have a social security properly institutionalized? Women, unpaid care work and domestic work by women. That's the social security of the informal economy. And nobody was paying attention to them. So I'm only a mayor. I cannot set up a new social security institution at the national level, but I'm a mayor. What do I have? Social infrastructure. Either I have it or I can build it. So we decided to use this social infrastructure, schools, civic centers, cultural centers, parks, and we add services so that we can offer the caregiver, the women caregivers. Look, in this infrastructure, we, the public servants of Bogota Mayor's Office, we're gonna take care of the people you're caring for. The kid, the elder, the family, I'm gonna take care of them. So that you have time for you, time to rest, time to finish high school, time to start a new certificate or professional program for you, time to find a new job, time to start a business that is suitable for your conditions. But it's time for women. Lifting them out of poverty. Half of the care of the women caregivers are under poverty. Of course, they cannot study, they cannot produce, they cannot get a job. Of course, they are under poverty. So now, the whole thing of the caring block is using the social infrastructure that was already used only for kids or mainly for kids and youth, for women, to give them back, first of all, time, second of all, education, third of all, income opportunities, and then formation. Formation to engage them socially, politically, and economically, so they can have economic autonomy and get out of our life under violence, either family violence, gender violence, or other forms of violence. The correlation between not having economic autonomy and having violence in your life is one of the highest in women around the world. That tends to be universal. So far, out of the more than 1,100 million women in my city, we've been able to serve 400,000 women under 20 care blocks around the city. And the master urban plan now says that in order to have a caring block for every woman, regardless of income, at the most at 30 minutes of your home, the city should have 45 caring blocks across the city. So as much as we are setting land and investments for the metro system, or for the great avenues, or for the parks, now the Master Urban Development Plan is setting land and public investment to build in the next 15 years these caring blocks for women. So that, as much we have kids to have at 30 minutes the school, but women need to have at most at 30 minutes a caring block that can offer them liberty, time, opportunities, education, income, freedom, formation to engage politically, socially, and economically. So that's the caring blocks system in Bogota. I'm so honored that I'm the first mayor to launch this in Latin America, but now we are sharing this idea. And Monterrey is also building a caring block system. Uruguay is also building a caring block system. We're learning from each other about that. And then I came to Seattle with the super blocks of Barcelona, of this remaking in a more greener, inclusive, pedestrian, according to the climate change challenges, the urban public space of the city. So I brought that in, and I said, so the caring blocks cannot be only social caring blocks to give women back opportunities, but to give these popular, so-called before informal neighborhoods a decent urban public space that is safer for pedestrians, that is safer for everybody, have more trees, that have more bikes, that have routes, circular routes of public buses, so they, men tend to go in a city from point A to point B. It could be by train or by bus or by car. We women, we move differently. we go from point A to B to C to D to E to come back. That's the way women move around the city. Because we need to bring the kid to the school, and then to buy some groceries, and then to go to work, and then maybe to have our family and our mother or grandfather to the health appointment that they have. So we're going in each movement like in 5 different movements. It needs a different design of the transportation system. It needs circular routes, connecting these social services that women and their families reach out. So that's the second thing we did. We changed not only to have a multimodal transportation decarbonized, we are investing heavily in decarbonization of transportation because it's important for social services, it's important for productive services, for a new urban economy that allows our people not to expend 2 hours moving from one place to another, but 30 minutes at the most, so that they can use that time for leisure, for their family, for productive purposes. And the third thing is the plan terrazas, So let me, we work and have a saving account and have, a social security formal. So we save and we got credit and we buy a home. That's sort of the formal economy works out. But the informal economy of a third of the families in my city doesn't work that well. They don't have access to banking accounts. They don't have access to credit. They don't even have a minimum wage. So, but they have they are street vendors, or they do domestic paid work at other women's houses or things like that. And they accumulate whatever they have, improving the piece of land. They either buy a piece of land, which is formal, or they invade a piece of land, which is formal or informal, safe or risky from the climate change point of view, but they have a plot. That's usually the first thing they have, a plot. And then they spend year by year by year, decade by decade, improving that plot with different materials and doing the home and stuff. And maybe after 20 years, they have the first story of the house. So the terraza plan was telling them, first of all, you're welcome to the city. I recognize you to the city. It's the first time in Bogota's history that the zoning master urban plan recognized and welcomed those kind of settlements. And said, I'm going to provide funds for you. Funds so that you can, first of all, funds. Second of all, a comprehensive housing and settlement improvement, socially and urbanly. And third, a curator. Like the private sector and the middle class and the high class, they have private curators in which they got the licensing of the urban plan and the housing plan. But these settlements never ever have a curator. So even if their house is well done, it's going to be a seismo-resistant home, they cannot prove that to the market, so they cannot use that home as a collateral, because they have nothing to prove. So it's investment, it's the public curator office of the mayor's office of Bogota, and it's a comprehensive, with investing money, improving plan of both the house and the settlement. For example, bringing, carrying blocks, super carrying blocks, including the urban improvement. So now this family can reach out the mayor's office, can apply to the social curator for a licensing of their home. So we will send engineers and architects to help them to figure it out, how do they build it, to say them, look, if you we're going to help you out and we're going to give you the money so that you can strengthen the first story and then to build the second story. And now you can rent, for example, to a different family the second story. That's going to be a new income. Or you can open up or improve this small shop that you have in the first story that's going to generate income for them. So it's improving their homes not only in the housing living conditions, but also in the economic, economy that works for that family, generating more income out of the housing, and improving the whole settlement. And making that certified by the city. So now this family not only have a better house and a second-story house or a shop within the house, but they have a collateral by first time. So they can connect with the other opportunities to move on. That's the Plan Terrazas. So at the end, you have the multimodal transportation system, which is heavily decarbonized because of electric buses or cables to connect the mountains with the metro system in the plain area of the city, the carrying blocks, and the curator and the improvement of the house. So it is my hope that we're not gonna name never, ever, nothing in Bogota an undesirable informal settlement. It's just popular families, working families in popular settlements that have a different economy. And we need to help the economy, not only the bricks of the house. No? Sometimes if you don't ensure them that you're not gonna kill the social connection and the social fabric and the popular economy that works with them, they will reject whatever help you offer them to improve the bricks, because their problem is not the bricks. They can live with it. The problem is not that the urban renovation or housing improvement don't kill that social fabric and don't kill that popular economy of the family, but improves them. If you offer them to improve the social fabric, the economic, and also the housing and the settlement, they will go for it. Otherwise, it will be a trouble. So this is the kind of things that we are trying to do. It was a great, like a dream come true. I am by formation, by professional academic formation. I'm a political scientist, an urban planner, and a public administrator. So it's like bringing the three things together in a time was incredibly challenging, but also is the first time that the mayor's office, after 17 years, was able to convince the national government, the private sector, and the city council to invest heavily, as never, ever, in these kind of programs, to restart the economy, but not in any way, but in a way that is actually inclusive, just, green, and caring for our people, particularly for women.
Thank you, Claudia. And it's not a coincidence that actually two of our case studies, the Council on Urban Initiatives, which is co-chaired by UN Habitat, LSE Cities, and my institute at UCL, the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose, has actually looked at Bogota to do case studies both on the housing and the care blocks, precisely to reveal these interesting new just properties, but also ways of working together in an outcomes-oriented way. And one of the papers we have with another council member, Leilani Farha, was precisely to bring a human rights approach, to bring legal accountability to all these different relationships and contracts between the different actors. So you've been a model for others to study. And again, this is a point of the council to start sharing practices, not using this old word, best practice. You know, what is best? It's not about best, it's what have you tried? What have you learned? What did it mean for really resetting that public-private third sector partnership and how you manage within your administration to work in that interdepartmental way, as opposed to seeing housing as a isolated area, which I know that Rahul Mehrotra, who's here, one of our other council members, last night brought up when he said, when we think of mobility, it doesn't mean anything just to move. What does it mean to move and to set up mobility systems that have at the center of them a design which thinks about livelihood, jobs, what kind of jobs, how long does it take you to get to the job, dwelling, and your house in the middle of a community, sustainability, so green is not something in and of itself, it is really nested within how we want to live together in a more sustainable way, and use that to design a mobility system. So you've given a great example, both on housing and care, using these as excuses to really completely change how we think actually in a holistic way about these human-centered focuses. So, Soledad, you not only were a Minister of Housing and Habitat in Paraguay who significantly increased the production of social housing for low-income populations, but also have been leading a civil society movement, Alma Civica. So maybe you can reflect on both of these, your experience both as minister, but also maybe some of the bottlenecks you faced where you realize that you also need civic participation, something that I know Lesley Lokko always reminds us of, that we also need civic education, which will be one of the issues in the next panel.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Mariana, and hello to everyone. Buonasera. I'm very happy to be here in Venice and sharing this amazing panel with these inspiring women. I'm gonna go back to Paraguay with, you know, a lot of like strength and aiming to do things so we can change and build better cities. So I'm gonna give you a little bit of context about Paraguay as well. And Paraguay is a 7 million country. We are located in the middle of South America, a landlocked country. We are the least urbanized country in South America, so we look a lot to what Colombia is doing, to what Brazil is doing, to what Chile is doing, so how they are dealing somehow with this rapid process of urbanization, so we can use that force somehow to create a well-being for the citizens. So that's the context about the country. I want to give you a context about the housing ministry as well. Before I was appointed as the housing minister, I have to say that the institution was very focused just on housing, you know, just to build like walls, roof, and floors, you know. The policy was not linking that process of building housing or houses with the city, with the territory, you know, with the interaction between urban and rural areas. So we had that challenge to amplify the look, the view, to somehow evangelize, I don't know if I can use that word, you know, just to start a pedagogy process so we can understand that building houses is not just about putting the roof on the walls, you know. So that was a very, very hard challenge that we had. Speaking about the bureaucracy, we also had a lot of challenges because the institution was very corrupt. It was recognized by the public opinion as one of the most inefficient institutions in the country. So we had to work a lot so we can change the culture of the institution so we can achieve the goals that we had back then. So how we did it, and I'm gonna just share a couple of tools maybe that we use and were very helpful back then for us. First, we have transparency as not as a goal, as a very important tool that we use so we can foster participation. Because citizens do not participate in something that they don't know what is happening, you know. So the first step was open up the institution. So we shared all the information we had. That was a huge change because we were coming from a secrecy culture, if I may say, and we changed it to an open institution. So from the national level, it even allowed more involvement of the local governments, you know? Because before, it was just the national government and with their interventions in the local territories, without coordination with local governments and opening up the information, it helped to build a better articulation from the national level with local levels and with local government levels, but also with communities. And another thing that was very important for us was community engagement, you know? So, and community engagement, not only sharing information, but making them part of the whole process of public policy making, you know? Like from the designing of the projects to the implementation of the projects, we work so the community could be part of the policy. And also, articulating with other sectors was very important for us, you know, like private sector, civil society, academia, so they can also feel that they are part of the process of shifting or changing the way the institution was working. So we developed the first national habitat and housing policy. It was the first in the history for Paraguay. So that was very helpful so we can have a mission, you know? Because if we don't have, like, at the end, like, public policies, what tells us is where we're going, you know? What's the direction that our institution, our society is taking. So for us, that process was very important, so we can build consensus with other sectors on what Paraguay should do regarding the building of better cities, you know, just healthy and greener cities. And that was, and for us, you know, like, related to the work you're doing, Mariana, which I find fantastic, you know, for us, reconnecting the institution and the stakeholders with the mission of the institution was key. We did a lot of things. I want to tell you just like small things that we did. For example, for instance, the administrative or the legal department were departments that were not in contact with the field. You know, they were not building the houses. They were not talking with the private sector. They were not connected with the mission. So on the weekends, we would take public servants from those departments so they can see what we were doing in the field, you know. And I remember having conversations with those public servants, you know, telling me like, oh my God, now I better understand, you know, that every check that I'm signing or every, like, dictamen, we say in Spanish, but every legal, like, dictamen that we write, it has a connection with a mission that we're doing. That was just a small thing, but we have, like, a lot of things that we did so we can have the mission, you know, as something that every public servant, but also every stakeholder outside the bureaucracy could have in their mind, so we can achieve the goal of housing for all. For us, that's how we somehow were able to increase the amount of houses delivered by the government, but also in partnership with the private sector in 3.5 years, you know? And I can still remember the first time we shared in a press conference the goal that we were having, putting it in numbers, that nobody believed us, you know? I had a lot of headlines in the press, you know, like saying the minister is crazy, you know? We don't have the capability of doing this as a country. I remember private sector, constructors, even public servants that were very worried, you know, like saying, what are you, like, we're not gonna be able to do this. But at the end, you know, having ambitious goals, but connecting those goals, those outputs with the outcome that we were looking for was key, so we were able to motivate the public servant, but also the other stakeholders to achieve that goal. And so those were like some things that for us were key, you know, like human-centered policy, having the people always in the center, building integrity, transparency, foster participation, engaging community. And now that I went into politics, if I may say, because before I was considered like a technician, even though I was holding a political position, you know, I was appointed by the president, but then I decided to run because somehow I realized that we need, in order to move forward the changes that we need in our societies, we need citizens to be involved with politics, you know? We cannot be afraid. I used to be, you know, I don't know, the young lady that comes from civil society, from the nonprofit sector, from the academia, who didn't want to get involved into politics, you know, but I understood that we need to follow that path. And I have to say, to end this part of my response, that I'm very worried about the state of democracy in our countries, you know. I think that democracy is at risk. I think that human rights are at risk with the rise of populism, with the flirting, if I may say, with authoritarian regimes, you know? And now in Paraguay, if you ask the youth if they would like a democracy or a a dictatorship as a political system. I think that more half of them, I can't recall the last like Latino barometer, you know, the indicators. It was 60% they said, yeah, that they don't care, you know. And if we are speaking about building better cities, if we are speaking about human rights, if we are speaking about building just cities, healthier and greener, we need to think about the health of our political system. And I have to say that I am very worried about the state of democracy. So thank you very much.
Before I come to Laura, so thank you so much, Soledad. And we're hoping that you come back and run for president soon. Skip the vice presidential one. One thing, I'm just going to make a warning, because we are running out of time, because we spoke a bit longer than 5 minutes, which is good, because we got to hear really great stories. I will ask you each, so you can start thinking a bit, what some of the lessons are from what you're also hearing from each other before we close. Very short, almost 2 or 3 sentences on something specific, which is what you just said. So what I see, for example, in the UK is that as soon as we have an alternative opposition government trying to win the election, even they buy into this idea. We can do some good things on housing, we can do some good things on climate, but to show that we're serious about the economy, we need to say we won't spend too much, or we won't actually tax wealth. I could go on, but that would become a whole conference. So the idea, I'd love for us to go back in order of, given what you've said and what you've learned from others, what might this mean for how we recapture, reorient the discussion about the economy? So it's not these nice stories, what you did on health, on housing, on care, and then somewhere else in a different room we talk about the economy. What is your advice, if you're speaking, for example, to the Minister of Finance or the Treasury, on how to use these stories, these experiences, these cases, these successes, these barriers, to reorient the language we use on the economy, so we don't get this kind of schizophrenic situation where, to show we're serious about the economy, actually we're going to say we're not going to spend too much on that and we won't tax the private sector and so on. So I'd like to come back to that later, just start thinking. And Laura, so as the vice mayor of Napoli, a city which all the Italians in the room will both love, but also know the huge problems that you have, the specific initiatives that you've been leading on, including one that Ricky Burdett, the co-chair of the council, works on, l'albergo dei poveri, the hotel for the poor. If you can really reflect on these very interesting experiences, also what you were saying last night about the common good, the need in the work that you've done to almost redefine il bene pubblico, il bene comune, at the center of the design of your policies. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess that I will be speaking in Italian for a symmetry with Ada, so we have, I don't know, okay. Innanzitutto grazie a Lesley Lokko, grazie a Mariana Mazzucato, Ricky Burdett e Council on Urban Initiative per essere in questa fantastica conversazione. Per uscire subito da un luogo comune, siamo 4 donne che lavorano lo dico al plurale, in italiano non si dice sud al plurale, ma siamo una pluralizzazione dei sud, Barcellona a suo modo, Napoli a suo modo naturalmente, 2 donne latinoamericane che portano sul tavolo delle differenze importanti. A me sembra questo un passaggio politico molto importante che grazie a Lesley e a Council of Urban Initiative stiamo facendo in questo momento. Lasciatemi dire 2 parole sul contesto del nostro lavoro, perché ascoltando loro posso dire che con le dovute differenze naturalmente noi ci troviamo a lavorare nel governo delle città, nel governo a livello centrale come nel caso di Soledad, in una condizione in cui le crisi globali a partire dal climate change sono state fortemente ridimensionate nella nostra percezione, nella nostra cultura, nei modi di produzione. Il lavoro di Mariana è molto esplicito su questo, lei parla dei grandi cambiamenti che si sono verificati tra la fine degli anni 80 e i primi anni 90 e questo ha portato a una trasformazione importante dello Stato. Il mio punto qual è? Il punto è che dentro questa grande trasformazione la conseguenza, una delle conseguenze più importanti è una sfiducia profonda verso le istituzioni pubbliche, una sfiducia profonda nei confronti dei saperi, nei confronti di quello che con termine unificato chiamiamo la scienza, e una sfiducia profonda nei dati. Quando Soledad dice nessuno credeva ai numeri che noi stavamo dicendo, mi sembra una cosa molto emblematica di quello che vorrei dire. Napoli diciamo, rappresenta, ne parlavamo stamattina con Rahul Mehrotra, a livello italiano almeno, rappresenta un caso estremo, e come tutti i casi estremi è un caso interessante su cui riflettere, perché ti fa vedere in una maniera molto tridimensionale delle condizioni e dei processi che si verificano anche altrove. È caso estremo perché le disuguaglianze e i divari che sono gravemente aumentati nel corso degli ultimi 20 anni sono molto evidenti, e ne parlerò tra un attimo sul lavoro che stiamo facendo, ma è anche, questo lo diceva Claudia prima, una città dove l'infrastruttura sociale è molto densa, è molto versatile, ed è anche una città che ha dato prova negli ultimi anni di saper praticare un'idea di bene comune non come azione surrogata rispetto alla mancanza dello Stato, ma come azione creativa di ingaggio civico nei luoghi di proprietà dello Stato. E quindi questo introduce un tema di rappresentanza molto interessante. Noi abbiamo lavorato sia nell'Albergo dei Poveri. L'Albergo dei Poveri è un delirio del XVIII secolo europeo, è la più grande costruzione che un re spagnolo volle realizzare con un grande architetto italiano per ospitare i poveri del regno. È un'architettura intelligente, basata su una divisione molto rigorosa dei generi, maschi e femmine, vecchi, bambini, ed è un luogo che è stato per moltissimo tempo uno spazio di accoglienza della povertà, del diverso, del bisognoso, e quindi noi abbiamo cominciato a ragionare su questo, cioè su come realizzare politiche che andassero incontro, rispetto al tema di cui ci occupiamo stasera, a obiettivi di sostenibilità, di maggiore uguaglianza, e questo lo abbiamo fatto sia nella costruzione della politica dell'Albergo dei Poveri, ma anche facendo un grande investimento, e lasciatemi parlare un momento della recovery plan, perché questo è un tema molto importante nelle città europee. Abbiamo fatto un investimento massivo sull'edilizia residenziale pubblica, public housing, quella è stata la nostra priorità, rispetto a processi di disuguaglianza che, come Barcellona ha insegnato, nascono con una iperturistificazione dei centri storici che espelle l'abitare popolare, e chiaramente, come dire, crea un problema di disuguaglianza molto importante. Noi abbiamo deciso di agire fondamentalmente sulle comunità più segregate, più marginalizzate. E come? E in questo, diciamo, mi sono molto ritrovata nell'idea della mission che c'è nel tuo libro, combinando politiche spaziali con politiche sociali e attivando un percorso di apprendimento istituzionale under pressure, perché il recovery plan ha delle scadenze e delle modalità di attuazione che non si sono mai viste in Europa, neanche ai tempi d'oro, diciamo, della ricostruzione dopo la guerra, e quindi questo, diciamo, ha portato a un intenso processo di apprendimento istituzionale, perché se c'è un piano di ricostruzione nazionale con fondi europei che non fa nessuna differenza tra, passatemi la semplificazione, la costruzione di un quartiere con la costruzione di una pompa di benzina, perché sto parlando di questo, cioè il recovery plan ti dà, appunto, come è successo in Paraguay, lo diceva Soledad prima, gli strumenti per intervenire, diciamo, sull'hardware della questione, ma non è disegnato come un programma complesso e integrato, infatti è organizzato in misure. Ciascuna delle misure risponde a un ministero e ciascun ministero ha una sua strategia nell'intervento. Questo è molto importante, l'agency dei soldi pubblici, perché questo è un tema su cui bisogna evidentemente riflettere. Quindi come combinare le indicazioni che ti arrivano dallo Stato per realizzare degli interventi che siano complessi, che abbraccino la complessità dei contesti, che lavorino sulla casa che non è il tetto sulla testa. La casa è infrastruttura umana, è condizione di accoglienza della diversità, è empowerment soprattutto dei gruppi vulnerabili ed è soprattutto lavoro. Questo naturalmente in Italia è un aspetto particolarmente importante. Quindi io vorrei riflettere, vorrei prendere il tempo che ho più brevemente possibile per riflettere su quali sono i nodi e le difficoltà alla luce dell'esperienza che ho brevemente menzionato su Napoli, che noi vediamo rispetto all'obiettivo di costruire città sostenibili, più giuste, più inclusive e più eque. Io credo che la risposta vada cercata nella intersezione tra politiche dello Stato, percezione sociale e nuove forme di povertà. Le politiche dello Stato nel senso di come si implementano le politiche dello Stato, come arrivano a dare vita a interventi reali. C'è un problema di governance molto importante in questo momento in Europa, perché c'è da un lato un neocentralismo dello Stato molto significativo. E il ruolo delle città in questo momento è un ruolo che, come diceva Ada, da un lato è il front line di tutti i problemi, con una capacità di spesa estremamente limitata e soprattutto un'autonomia decisionale e politica molto limitata. Pensiamo, io parlo della mia città, noi abbiamo ormai, l'Italia gestisce con i porti gli sbarchi quotidiani dei migranti che arrivano dalla costa africana e noi abbiamo a Napoli una media di circa 200 minori non accompagnati che arrivano dalle rotte migratorie. Per dare solo un esempio, diciamo, di questo problema, il primo punto che vorrei sottolineare, la governance, e cioè la necessità di riflettere come comunità scientifica e come comunità politica su come migliorare le relazioni, la filiera delle relazioni che passano attraverso lo Stato e arrivano alle città e viceversa. Questo secondo me è un tema cruciale. Il secondo tema è la questione della percezione. Voi sapete benissimo che le agende politiche sono totalmente, diciamo, condizionate da quella che è la percezione dell'elettorato. E questa cosa, non che io adesso voglia, diciamo, rivendicare e rivalutare i numeri, i metodi quantitativi, ma questa cosa è un problema per chi disegna le politiche. Perché esiste un problema serio, di questo diciamo, ne ho contezza soprattutto in Italia e attraverso il confronto che io ho con i colleghi che lavorano in altre grandi amministrazioni italiane, c'è un problema di politica dei dati. I dati non sono resi pubblici, o comunque i dati non aggregati, quelli più a grana fine, che ti fanno capire com'è cambiata la società, dove si è spostato il bisogno, quali sono le condizioni su cui intervenire. Questo, benché noi si viva in un'economia dei dati ossessiva, perché tutto quello che facciamo è catturato dal mercato dei dati, le pubbliche amministrazioni hanno un problema di politica dei dati. Questo è un fatto sicuramente molto importante. La terza questione, l'ultima che vorrei dire, ha a che fare con le nuove forme di povertà. Noi ci troviamo in una condizione molto singolare in Europa. Da un lato i mercati continentali sono saturi e il grande capitale comincia a investire. A Barcellona hanno investito già, ora investono a Napoli, ad Atene, quindi si sta spostando un movimento anche fondiario molto significativo. Nello stesso tempo però le forme di povertà si sono acuite e moltiplicate. Io ora ragiono da planner, noi usiamo standard, usiamo delle categorie per pianificare le strade, le case, le scuole, ma quelle categorie riflettono una società che è sparita, che è una società che un tempo si poteva comprare la macchina, faceva figli, li mandava a scuola nel sistema pubblico, era composta da una dimensione media, ma questo oggi che fine ha fatto il ceto medio? The middle class, where did it go? E questo è il problema. La burocrazia ragiona con delle categorie che poi sono i fondamenti delle procedure. Io trovo che il discorso sulla burocrazia vada assolutamente riportato al centro della nostra riflessione, perché altrimenti non si capisce quel terreno di relazioni di potere, perché è questo, su cui poi si giocano delle partite molto importanti che ti consentono o di portare a casa un risultato alla fine della giornata oppure no. E su questo bisogna ragionare bene, nel senso che anche io lavoro su contesti, le vele di Scampia, che sono famose per il film Gomorra, per esempio. Lì noi abbiamo una delle comunità più colpite da fenomeni severi di marginalità e di segregazione. Noi quest'anno, dopo 2 anni di lavoro sul campo con la comunità, dopo 2 anni di conflitti, di diffidenze, di sfiducia nei confronti dell'amministrazione, noi siamo entrati nelle vele a fare il censimento degli abitanti, perché lo Stato non lo sa, a proposito della città informale, non lo sa come è cambiata la società che abita in questi contesti. Esistono dei dati che rispondono a logiche che non hanno più nessun senso, ma se oggi pensi, io ho incontrato storie di donne straordinarie, forme di, gli urbanisti lo chiamano di sovraffollamento abitativo, cioè nello stesso appartamento ci abitano 3 generazioni di donne, la nonna, la mamma e la figlia con i bambini piccoli. Gli uomini in genere, diciamo, hanno problemi con la giustizia. Questo per dire cosa? Che c'è, diciamo, una ricomposizione e una riorganizzazione della vita all'interno dei grandi complessi di edilizia residenziale pubblica, ma non solo a Napoli. Succede a Roma al Quarticciolo, al Corviale, succede a Milano a Gratosoglio, è così, cioè l'Italia è un paese che è cambiato, la società è cambiata e quindi se noi vogliamo pensare a politiche orientate a criteri di giustizia, se vogliamo seguire questo obiettivo, se vogliamo atterrare finalmente sulla Luna, l'alleanza deve avvenire non solo attraverso le parti sociali, e questo va da sé, ma deve anche avvenire attraverso una profonda riformulazione degli strumenti che abbiamo a disposizione. E di questo si parla troppo poco, può sembrare un discorso riduttivo, ma io credo che la tecnica, questo l'ha detto Ricky in un'intervista di qualche giorno fa, la tecnica è profondamente e radicalmente politica e io di questo sono molto convinta. Grazie.
Grazie Laura. E soprattutto grazie per aver rilevato questo tema sia dei dati che la burocrazia. Mi ricordo, Ada, quando tu hai portato dentro del City Council computer hackers, no? Cioè fare sexy, lavorare nel governo, vuol dire anche portare dentro i hackers che usualmente lavorano nei startups proprio per cambiare questo rapporto fra la città e i dati e usare i dati, nuovi modi non solo di raccoglierli, ma farli usare per migliorare il trasporto pubblico, la salute pubblica, la pubblica educazione. E anche pensando a quello che hai detto sulla burocrazia, in Italia la so-called riforma della pubblica amministrazione è sempre stata solo tagli, non è stato investimento nel stesso settore pubblico per essere più flessibile, agile e capace di gestire i dati, quindi incredibilmente importante. Mi hanno detto che abbiamo un po' più tempo di quello che pensavo, quindi perché non prendiamo, direi, 4 domande una dopo l'altra, lascio poi il panel spargerli fra di loro come vogliamo. Ogni persona non può rispondere a 4 e poi vi chiedo ognuna di, in meno di un minuto, rispondere un po' a questa domanda: quali sono i lessons che we gather from this interaction on how can we actually put these social challenges, these concrete people-centered challenges in the way we actually talk about the economy, disrupting the old dichotomy, serious economics there, and then your specific pet project in the corner somewhere. Ok. 4 domande, scusate che continuo ad andare dall'inglese all'italiano, potete fare la domanda in qualsiasi lingua che volete. Non so chi ha i microfoni, lascio Ricky, magari, o Isadora, qualcuno riesce a vedere chi ha la mano alzata? È breve, per favore.
Velocissimamente, e intanto grazie per l'ultimo, anzi di tutti gli interventi. Ringrazio Barcellona, Bogotà, ringrazio il Paraguay e ringrazio Napoli, perché credo che col sindaco De Magistris, che è venuto qua a Venezia spesso, un lavoro c'è stato fatto. La mia domanda è questa. Credo che nel dibattito, almeno che io non capisca male l'inglese, manchi una parola, forse magica, forse no, ma si tratta del progetto partecipato. La parola partecipazione credo sia venuta fuori, ovviamente la informal life o informal plan o informal building, ma il metodo partecipativo nato in Francia nel 94, io ho fatto 17 anni all'estero, per cui il débat public famoso, devo dirlo qui perché purtroppo non c'è il sindaco, non c'è, ma peccato, qualcuno spero glielo vada a riferire, e magari l'illustre professor Sennett potrebbe farlo, per conto dei veneziani magari. E manca la voce di questi 999 veneziani che, come me, lavora nel territorio, in questo caso mi occupo di Laguna, da 27 anni. Vorrei che tutti voi portassero sul tavolo un metodo partecipativo con cui noi possiamo contribuire per capire se questa città, Venezia, non una città a caso, scusate, con tutto rispetto per tutti i territori del pianeta, ma se questa parola magica, in qualsiasi lingua la si voglia interpretare, può essere e deve essere, perché in Francia hanno cominciato molto tempo fa, io ho partecipato e ho vissuto in Francia per quanto basta, per capire se noi come cittadini possiamo realmente contribuire a modificare la politica, perché è di questo che si tratta.
In modo da avere altre 3 domande bisogna andare avanti. Comunque grazie molto, è una domanda importantissima proprio perché ognuna di voi in realtà ha parlato di questo nel nostro meeting questa mattina, quindi è importantissimo portarlo qua. Participatory democracy, co-creation, Ada e Soledad, tutte e due i movimenti sociali dove voi avete messo l'enfasi sulla partecipazione, importantissimo. Grazie per la domanda. 3 altre più brevi possibili, proprio così abbiamo più tempo possibile per le risposte dai nostri 4 panelist. Grazie. E se ognuno può dire il nome, magari dove lavorate o cosa fate nella vita.
Pronto? Ok. Buonasera a tutti. Il dibattito è stato davvero estremamente interessante. Io mi collego anche al signore che ha appena parlato, quindi riferimento ancora a Venezia. Mi chiamo Marco, io vengo dalla provincia di Pesaro Urbino. Ho avuto il privilegio questo mese di rimanere a Venezia. Mia figlia studierà per 1 anno qui a Venezia, alla Ca' Foscari, e ho avuto la percezione di come il sindaco, l'amministrazione si disinteressino di tutto quello che riguarda davvero la città, il centro storico, l'Arsenale, Palazzo Grassi, la mostra del cinema. Ecco, sono luoghi straordinari, ma ripeto, il centro è del tutto abbandonato. Si è parlato recentemente anche delle, chiamiamoli murales, insomma, di questi atti vandalici. Io non so se davvero le istituzioni, il sindaco, gli amministratori la sera alle 10, alle 11, mezzanotte percorrono le strade del centro e si rendono conto di quella che è la situazione. Ripeto, io ho avuto questa percezione essendo vissuto per 1 mese in questa città. È veramente una cloaca ad una certa ora della sera. Quindi realmente io penso che anche appunto chi lavora e si occupa appunto della città debba anche interrogarsi su questo, non solo ripeto, sull'Arsenale, sui grandi musei. È una città che viene maltrattata continuamente.
Grazie. Altre due e poi organizziamo le risposte. Magari una donna, abbiamo sentito due uomini, ci sono...
Is this, yes.
Okay.
My name's Jane Damosto. I run a small charity here in Venice called We Are Here Venice. I have zillions of questions I'd like to ask you all, given this concentration of important experience. But to latch on to the previous two questions, I think what's very much in our mind, thinking of Venice right now, is the fact that UNESCO is about to deliberate whether or not to declare Venice and the lagoon imperiled World Heritage. And I imagine that all of you from your different places have had experience of interacting with UNESCO, and maybe you have a view on how useful this kind of decision could be, and how citizens, through participatory processes or in the absence of participatory processes, can make most use of this situation.
Thank you. Abbiamo un'altra o no? Io non vedo da qui, quindi aspetto.
There's a girl there, but if only 4 questions, she has to.
Sì. Se poi c'è tempo per altre, facciamo un altro round, ma per adesso 4, grazie.
Hi, I'm Nyaleti Hanwana from Mozambique. Thank you so much for this fantastic conversation. I'll try and be brief so my friend can ask his question. Talking to a panel full of women, I think all of you have spoken about essentially politics very much from a feminist perspective, and using these feminist principles of transparency and power sharing to sort of bring back the curtain on political engagement, and talking about the fact that young people and the youth and really there's this sort of occlusion, if you will, around how people can engage politically. Can you speak to a little bit how these feminist principles are really starting to shift the narrative and the way that ordinary citizens might better engage in local politics at your level, and talk a little bit more about that civic education that is so central to that?
Great. Okay, so maybe we actually go back in the order. So we have 2 that were both on participation, asked in different ways. One on how we even defined World Heritage, and advice of how to also get citizens involved and thinking about, you know, those 3 questions were all on Venice, which is great because we're in Venice, but they opened up a big box actually of questions that can be applied to any country. But the question on UNESCO, and then this last question on feminist principles, which was very interesting. You said that because no one used the word feminist, but you're absolutely right. All the language that was used, including care, and how we even define care, of course, comes from feminist practice. So I was thinking actually, Soledad and Ada, if you can both take the 2 questions on participation, because you've worked so much on that. Is that okay?
Sì, ringraziare anche gli interventi, perché servono anche a poter mettere tante cose, no, che restavano da dire. Con quest'idea generale della partecipazione, che era su quasi tutti gli interventi, no? Hanno parlato di partecipazione, anche riprendendo il filo dell'intervento, no, della collega di Napoli, che parlava di questa sfiducia sulla politica e direi di più antipolitica. Direttamente c'è un movimento fortissimo che l'estrema destra sa usare molto bene per minare la democrazia. Questo lo stiamo vedendo non soltanto in America Latina, ma nel mondo intero e anche a casa nostra, no? E quindi con questo movimento forte dell'antipolitica credo che abbia molto a che fare, e che le città sono la risposta, perché le città sono il luogo della vita quotidiana, il luogo dove l'amministrazione può essere più vicina e avere più scambi con i cittadini direttamente su ogni argomento, no? che è importante per la loro vita, e dove si organizza la vita con tutti i bisogni di cura, di educazione, di sanità, di servizi in generale. E quindi dobbiamo sfruttare al massimo questa possibilità di partecipazione che secondo me è stata un po' trascurata negli ultimi decenni, no? Perché dobbiamo anche definire partecipazione. Partecipazione cos'è? Che tu in politica disegni dal governo una politica e poi all'ultimo momento chiedi l'opinione che non è decisiva dei cittadini. Questo secondo me crea frustrazione e anche fa arrabbiare i cittadini spesso, perché ti dicono mi far perdere il tempo, che non ho il tempo da perdere, no? Quindi partecipazione deve essere un'altra cosa. Io ho avuto un'esperienza molto positiva che vorrei condividere. Abbiamo usato molto la partecipazione noi in questi 8 anni a Barcellona per tante cose, per esempio i giovani. Prima si diceva, si parla sempre in nome dei giovani, si criminalizza i giovani. Con la pandemia è stato bestiale, come tanti discorsi istituzionali hanno criminalizzato i bambini e i giovani in modo assolutamente ingiustificato. Secondo me, io sto aspettando ancora che lo Stato spagnolo chieda scusa formalmente ai bambini della Spagna, perché li hanno chiusi per 3 mesi senza nessuna ragione scientifica. C'è una roba allucinante che ha causato un danno bestiale, no? Quindi io spero che un'istituzione democratica chieda scusa quando sbaglia in un modo così grave come questo, che ha creato problemi di salute mentale, eccetera, eccetera, no? Quindi, dicevo, bisogna ridefinire, no, chi sono i protagonisti della politica. Questo vuol dire partecipazione. Noi nel nostro modello di città la prima cosa in realtà che abbiamo fatto è cambiare le gerarchie e cambiare i protagonisti. C'era una politica che era fatta soprattutto per una città del secolo scorso, produttivista, dove la macchina era nel centro del disegno, proprio perché la città serviva a produrre quello che facevano, il lavoro riconosciuto come lavoro che facevano gli uomini fondamentalmente, e le donne lavoravano però senza riconoscimento, no? E quindi sono tanti soggetti che non venivano riconosciuti come cittadini con tutti i diritti. E questa è la prima cosa che bisogna sistemare, no? Noi abbiamo cercato molto nel nostro modello di città di proprio cambiare questa gerarchia, mostrare la pluralità della cittadinanza. La metà delle persone sono donne, no? E questo non veniva visibilizzato nelle politiche urbane, e quindi ridefinire lo spazio, il trasporto, le priorità dei servizi sociali, eccetera, tenendo conto di questa diversità. E anche i bambini, che per me è una causa personale, questa cosa di società adultocentrica che nega ai bambini di essere soggetti di pieno diritto e non li tratta come persone, e quindi questo mi sembra un errore strutturale fondamentale delle nostre società, no? E che bisogna essere cambiato. Questo lo collego con le politiche concrete di Barcellona, no? E con l'idea di partecipazione per finire l'intervento. Noi si è parlato, Barcellona è stata famosa in questi anni per avere un modello di città che viene conosciuto come superblocks, superiglia, no? Che vuol dire trasformare tutta la città, non solo un quartiere, una zona, ma tutta la città, cambiando le priorità. La prima cosa era ridurre l'inquinamento, perché abbiamo dei livelli di inquinamento che stanno ammazzando la popolazione, quindi è una questione di salute pubblica, ma non è soltanto una questione di difendere la salute e ridurre l'inquinamento, è un'opportunità di guadagnare più spazio pubblico di qualità per avere una città migliore. E cosa vuol dire una città migliore? Non solo con dei servizi pubblici, non solo senza l'inquinamento, con più verde, con più trasporto pubblico, ma anche con più spazio di qualità dove far rinascere e rinforzare la democrazia in città, dove far rinascere l'idea di comunità, no? Dei quartieri che proprio danno identità, che danno sicurezza alle persone che vivono in quella città. E questo è che l'abbiamo iniziato a trasformare tutta la città, e ha avuto dei premi di Nazioni Unite, riconoscimenti, e adesso abbiamo anche vinto la capitalità mondiale dell'architettura per il 2026, quindi tanti riconoscimenti internazionali, ma questo secondo me è meno importante. Siamo riusciti a far scendere molto l'inquinamento, quindi anche questo è un obiettivo concreto molto importante, ma per me la cosa più importante, dove ho imparato di più, è quando I cittadini hanno preso questo modello, l'hanno fatto suo, hanno iniziato a difenderlo al di là di quello che faceva il comune. Lì è iniziato qualcosa di nuovo, davvero rivoluzionario. E questo sono molto orgogliosa che è successo con un'intuizione che ho avuto alla fine dei primi 4 anni, che bisognava lavorare il nuovo modello di città, di urbanismo, di superblocks, lavorando prioritariamente con le scuole. Le scuole stanno in tutti i quartieri, le scuole sono trasversali, tutte le famiglie di ogni tipo, in tutta la loro diversità, vanno alle scuole e quindi sono un soggetto, un attore di trasformazione della città. Se tu coinvolgi le scuole nella trasformazione della città, quella trasformazione diviene reale e non soltanto una idea astratta che viene fatta da un architetto. Sì, finisco qua. E questa è la cosa più bella. Cioè noi abbiamo usato le scuole prima con l'idea di proteggere, no, l'intorno della scuola, abbiamo creato delle piazze davanti a più di 200 scuole pubbliche, ma abbiamo iniziato creando questa protezione perché i bambini siano sicuri quando entrano, escono, però poi lì hanno iniziato relazioni sociali tra i vicini, tra le famiglie, si è creato questa piazza democratica davanti alla scuola e abbiamo coinvolto la scuola per esempio nella lotta contro l'emergenza climatica e stiamo facendo che le scuole siano rifugi climatici con le ondate di caldo per esempio. E in tanti altri progetti di città abbiamo coinvolto le scuole, no? Con questa immagine che io dico sempre, sono arrivata in una città dove tu vedevi sempre dove c'era un parcheggio, no? Perché la macchina è una cosa più importante e vedevi la P del parcheggio nel blu grande e lo potevi vedere a 500 metri, ma non vedevi dove c'era una scuola. Vabbè, vediamo cambiare il modello di città e non sono più così importanti i parcheggi, sono molto più importanti le scuole che tra l'altro hanno i nostri bambini che oltre ad essere soggetti di diritti sono il futuro, sono loro che devono credere alla loro possibilità di trasformare la città e costruire un mondo nuovo. Se noi non riconosciamo il loro potere, loro non sentiranno questo potere. Se in cambio noi lo riconosciamo, diamo una potenza che secondo me ci sorprenderà positivamente.
Grazie Anna. Allora, super veloce, abbiamo Soledad che anche parlerà di participation e co-creazione, poi Claudia dirà qualcosa su questi principi femministi, anche perché abbiamo fatto un dialogo recentemente in un podcast, non so cos'era, su quello. E poi Laura, non so se puoi address la domanda su UNESCO e citizen participation, anche sul heritage and protection of our national.
Great. Well, first I have to say that I totally agree that we need to talk more and do more related to participation and participatory processes. And speaking from the government side, but also like from the society side, you know, like finding ways so we can participate in the processes that are going on in our countries. So we have lack of trust, we have limited public participation, polarization, problem that democracy is having, not delivering results. So I guess all of these and many more variables are the ones who are like eroding our political system. And I feel that participation is one of the answers, or enhancing participation, fostering participation is one of the answers that the systems should give so we can save democracy somehow, you know. And I want to speak from my experience running a nonprofit organization 15 years ago, which is called Techo. It's a Latin American organization which mobilizes their youth so they can influence housing and habitat policies. And I found that the youth, like the way we were able to mobilize in Paraguay more than 15,000 young people, you know, which was like a huge number for our country, was giving them a concrete way so they can change the reality, you know? So they were the ones in charge of doing things. So in the case of Techo, you go a weekend to a slum, you work with a family, you build an emergency home, you connect with the social needs, and you feel, or you get like the questions of what else should I do so this reality could change, you know, when you go back home. So we used to say that every emergency house that was built was denuncia social, you know, like a way of actively protesting the unjust system. You know, the emergency house that were built by volunteers was not a solution of the housing problem, but it elevated a voice, you know, that something is not working, so that's why young people from 18 years old or 20 or 21 are working with these families, working with this community, so we can change our reality. So I think that that was a very important incentive, so the youth could be like involved with a public problem, you know, or a public like situation that must be changed. And another thing that we did, like on the practical side, was which was key for us, was to involve the youth, was to partner with universities, you know, and use them as bridges to connect opposite sides of society. Those with privilege, you know, going to university, with families living in extreme poverty. So at the beginning, universities gave credits so the students could go and work and build the homes. And that was a way to incentive early participation. And we used to say that it didn't matter how they came to how they came or why, you know, if that incentive was the credit of university, that's okay. If you just want to go because your friend is going, that's okay. What matters is how you live the experience, you know, and how the experience somehow transform the view you have of the society and your interest in participating. So I've seen so many young people, you know, going to these activities and then trying to influence public policy, then trying to be involved with the housing ministry, then changing their careers, you know, because they wanted to do something about our reality. So that was the experience in Techo. Then in Alma Cívica also we work like developing a lot of capacity building and educational programs so we can incentivize like citizens to be involved in the public policy process. But that's like a long conversation, so I'm gonna stop here.
Okay. Thank you. Laura and then Claudia.
Yeah, this UNESCO thing is really relevant in the Venezia's case and in general. I see both sides of the problem. Like, on the one hand, you have, of course, the city runs the risk of losing the label. So that's a matter of reputation, because of course everybody wants to be in the list, right? Everybody wants to be in the World Heritage List. So there's a problem of positionality and of course a reputation that is really related to the power that is actually exerted by this global organization over local, you know, context in a way. The other side, though, is that like all institutions, even UNESCO is changing and it's taking a more inclusive and broader range of activities because there's a lot of countries and cities and things that want to be in the list, which are not Italy. They don't have the Renaissance, they don't have the Romans, they don't have the Greeks. They have different things. So UNESCO is changing. This is really interesting if you look at how the institution is changing, because they're pushing more on the relationship between heritage and everyday life. So the idea that also in a place like Venezia, people can actually live in a place like this, which means pushing more the ecology of life that is related to heritage, not just tourism that is just consumption of all of these things. It's just, you know, having a real habitat for communities and people. And this is really interesting. So in a way, I think that this is, of course, this is a critical point, but also it's a big wake-up call, because when global institutions speak, this means that when there's a public recognition of the risks that Venezia, but I also speak on behalf of Napoli because we're having the same problem. We have a huge surge of over-tourism started in 2016, and I mean, Of course, during the pandemic, the thing all stopped, but now it's really skyrocketing. So we need to do something. And so it's a big wake-up call, and it's about, you know, public recognition. It's about a global conversation about Venezia, and I think that it's in a way, it's a good thing. Of course, there's a lot of political work involved because, of course, UNESCO is not a charity. It's an institution that really influences the way they, you know, cities make their policies, they invest on their heritage. It's, of course, a lot of money flowing in because, of course, this kind of, you know, attention. But I think that, I mean, as all things, it's controversial, it's a phase, it's a process, but I think that at the end of the day, this is not really bad for me. If Venezia takes action now and the city does something about this kind of desertification of life from the city center because of over-tourism. And I'm very sensitive and I have a lot of solidarity with the city because, as I said, even in my context, we're dealing with the same problem. So we are actually speculating and wondering what we can do, especially because Napoli is, like Venezia, is one of the very few historic centers that are enlisted in the World Heritage List. So this is a big reputational argument. So yeah, that's my point.
Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, so the next election, you can vote him out. Now, this financialization and touristification of Venice, which, as you say, some politicians not only do nothing about, but actually support. Yeah. But also, just coming to this last question, which Claudia will talk about, I think just to remind ourselves what Lesley Lokko has done to all of us is allowed us to experience this Biennale, putting together things that are often not put together, provoking us to think differently. The decarbonization and decolonization theme of the Biennale, which was extremely radical, is, in fact, requires that kind of feminist lens in the way that you asked the question. And feel free to answer it in whatever way you want, but also the work that you talked about, what it meant to bring a particular lens to it. It's not just housing and care, as you said, but it was the way that you actually tackled it from a feminist perspective.
Well, as you said, we are talking about caring because we are a feminist panel, in the sense that we are all women leading roles, and brought new topics and new ways of do things. You know, the schools and the civic centers and the parks that I built upon the caring system of Bogotá were already there for decades. It's just that they were used in a way that didn't serve to free women, to give them back time and opportunities. It just literally lends. It's not I haven't built one thing for the caring block. Build it, actually. I'm just reusing all the social infrastructure was already there. But there is something that is sort of curious in my life, and because I'm a woman, everybody thinks that I'm a feminist, and they expect that I'm a feminist. I'm an expert feminist, and I wasn't. Actually, that was not my background. I came from political science. I came from journalism. I mean, my life was a different life on that. And because I'm a lesbian, then everybody expects that I'm an expert on LGBT rights and whatever, which I'm not. I happen to be a lesbian, but I'm not a, you know, an LGBT rights activist. That was not my background. It's not that it's not my interest. Of course it's my interest, but not my background. But then everybody expects, so you have to sort of learn. And I have this great opportunity to learn from if you ask me where the caring blocks idea and proposal came in, it didn't come in from me. It came from the popularly elected woman councils in Bogotá. That's where the idea came from. And during the campaign, we were like 4 candidates, actually. I was the only woman. During the campaign, all those popularly elected, Bogotá, which is a big city, I told you, is divided in 20 localities. And each locality we have actually, maybe too much, maybe more than 35 citizens popularly elected councils for participation. The Youth Council, the Women Council, the Culture Council, the Sports Council, is that, I have no time enough going to those 35 participatory councils, but I try to do it at least twice a year. And the law mandates to any mayor to go at least once a year to work with these participatory citizen councils. So the Women Council, which has 20 different councils by each locality, and the District Women Council proposes not exactly the caring blocks. They were talking to me, talking about the caring economy. So they taught me, if our domestic caring work, which is unpaid, would have been paid and would have been counted in Colombia's GDP, it will account for 20% of Colombia's GDP. It will be the most important sector, economic sector in the country. And if you will account my domestic unpaid care work in the Bogota's economy, it will account for 13% of GDP. Impressive. Why Colombia has this in the national accounts? Why? Because the first elected woman in Congress 20 years ago made mandatory by law to account this. So in the last 10 years, we've been talking about the caring economy, how much it represents, how much it accounts in the economy, why all this income is actually generated by women, but the woman who generated is in poverty because nobody cares about them. So this is a 15-year conversation. And now I won the election. I said, Jesus Christ. And now what I'm going to do with that? I have these numbers, figures, proposals. Do something about the caring economy of women. Do something for women. Help women, which in the traditional national politics of Colombia, helping women means giving them some subsidy per each child they have, which for feminists is like crime. No, you don't help our women because they are mothers. In the first place, you don't help them out. I mean, from the feminist point of view, this is like what you should not do. To create a child subsidy per woman, that's exactly what they don't expect you to do, right? So from the feminist point of view, that's not what they want. But for the woman, I'm talking to you about her lovely, they are leaders by themselves, but they were not asking for caring blocks. They were asking for child subsidies. That's what the women were been asking for. But that just, even if I have the money, and at some point I have the money, I will reproduce the same machistic, patriarchal culture if I take that path. So it was about using the money to use it for something that was not asked and providing it in a way that can change that culture. So in the caring blocks, let me give you what is a feminist perspective in the caring blocks of Bogota. We provide in each of the caring blocks three services. The first is we care for those they were caring for. We take care of the kids, of the elders, of the people with disabilities. Second of all, we care for the woman, meaning we offer them time, education, income, empowerment, formation, political participation, so on and so forth. And we offer men of this world, you can learn to care. It's not that it comes in the woman DNA, right? You don't know how to clean, wash, read with your kids, bring your grandparent to the doctor, you can learn. And that's a cultural transformation. So within the caring blocks, we have what we call the men's caring school. Welcome men of this world to learn to care, right? So I don't want you, woman, to come just you or just the people you're caring, telling me about your family. So somebody you share your life with, right? Your loved one. Bring him. But not bring him so I will sort of, no? Point him, saying, you're the bad guy of this poor woman. No. I invite you, all the entire family, to change, to have a time to reflect. You all could be better off and to take care of each other better if you simply assume every single role, you can change it tomorrow, daily, on a daily basis. So what if we start in a day in which your son or the other members of your family or your loved one come to the school, the men's school of caring. They learn to read with your kids, to bring them to school, to cook. That's a different role. That's cultural transformation. And that's probably most important to prevent violence and abuse and the forbiddenness of an economic autonomy for that woman. That's probably more important than the education title that she can get at the care block. Because as Shakira said, women, we don't cry. We produce. And if we produce for ourselves, and we are able to have that trust, that confidence, that we can lead our life for our better. And if we are better, maybe we can care about others. But this idea that being a good woman is sacrificing everything, your health, your time, your education, your income, for your kids, for your loved one, for the man of your family. And that's what makes you a good woman. This, I cannot tell you in Latin America how strong this conservative, Catholic, patriarchal idea is. So actually the most important transformation of the caring block is making a reflection of the kids, the loved one, the man, the woman, that this is not necessarily to be a good woman. I wanted to erase the word sacrifice. As the minute you're telling me you're sacrificing something, income, time, whatever, then we are in the wrong position. If everybody's winning up and sharing up and growing together, now we are in the nice, sort of idea. That's the closest to feminism in caring blocks that I can come with.
It's a fantastic note to end on. The provocation I was going to ask you all to answer, there's no time, but I can think of no better ending than really talking about the cultural transformation, starting with ourselves and the family, and debunking the kind of bullshit around what it means to be a good woman in that context. So thank you. Thank you to this wonderful panel, to all of you. Thank you for the audience. Do we now have a little break, or we actually, 5 minutes? Okay. So hopefully there's 30 toilets, but okay. Thank you, everybody.
Right, thank you for joining us again for the last session. Mariana thinks we might have another one, but I think this is the second and the final one. So let me start by introducing myself, Ricky Burdett, with Mariana Mazzucato. I'm co-chair of the council that we've already talked a lot about, and these are all council members. We thought at one moment we would have all 10 of us up here, but I guess we would have been here till 10 o'clock at night if we had done that. But we do see this, I think, very much as a seamless conversation. It's not two separate conversations, also because we need to remind ourselves that with Lesley, we did come up with the notion this session should be called governing, designing, and educating urban futures. All part, 3 verbs, which are about the future of the cities that we live in. And while the earlier part was very much a discussion about governance at many, many levels, with a strong emphasis, of course, as we heard at the end, on participation, this session is really looking at these 2 other keywords, which are so central, Lesley, to your Biennale, but to the Biennale di Architettura in and of itself, which is the physicality of cities. And if I just think in my mind that, are we talking about design, are we talking about education? We're actually talking at one level about educating designers, and we're going to hear a lot about that because some of our speakers are very much involved in that. But we're also talking about designing education. And I think, Lesley, as you know, not only from your past experience, but being a curator, being a director of a machine like this one, it's very much part of the process of education. Education of the general public, education of many school children who visit. They already heard about the importance of the Biennale College. So we're in a way extending that discussion. And without needing to, I think, in a way rehearse why we're having this part of the discussion, I'm reminded that there are sort of parallels to what Mariana was introducing in terms of sort of the 3 types of big questions that we might be addressing, and I'm going to ask my colleagues to address in a moment. First of all, just a very simple one, and of course, we heard it in Laura Lieto's comment when she described the Vele, this 1960s modernist icon, as a slum. Inequality is spatial. It's not abstract. It actually coalesces in built form, and I think that is one of the fundamental things that we're interested in. The second is that, therefore, as we shape the future, how do we avoid the mistakes of what we've done in the past? And this is where the notion of education really comes in. And the third point is the one about unlearning what we've learned. I think what we're very clear here, and every time we talk about this in our council, which is very international, as you've heard, we see the reproduction of models that go back 30, 40, 50, in some cases 100 years, hence the importance of decolonization in and of itself as a concept. We see the reinforcement of these models in what is designed, but also in what is practiced in education. And we have 4 people, 4 colleagues of mine who are in many ways involved in both aspects of, of design and education, but at very different levels. Richard Sennett, who will start with an introductory comment in a moment, has, of course, written extensively for many, many years about the relationship between physical form and social form, if I could call it that, both as a writer, as an observer, a commentator, but also very much as an educator. Alcinde is an anthropologist who now works within the United Nations organization, but has studied youth movements in Africa, Mozambique in particular, and I think is very sensitive to nearly the education of institutions, even though you have been a colleague and will be a colleague at the London School of Economics and a new center in Africa. Dan is impossible to define because he's done so many jobs, all at the interface of design, society, innovation, governance, that it's difficult to pin you down, but is now quite recently running a new, well, for you, a new post at the Melbourne School of Design where architecture and other disciplines come together. And I think you're very intrigued by these things. And Raul Maroto, whose exhibit, wonderful exhibit in the Arsenale, just a few rooms down from here, actually takes as a starting point the interfaces of research, education, and practice. So I think everyone here is well placed to address these issues. And I'm going to start, Richard, by asking you to maybe speculate on your thoughts on this issue of how the spatial and the social connect or don't connect when it comes to the education of the architect and, of course, wider society.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Lesley, for organizing not only a wonderful Biennale, but making it possible for the council to be part of it. I have very few brief remarks, and they're based on the fact that as an educator, I've become increasingly despairing of how people who are designers and urban planners are formed. There's something very wrong about the way we create people who are engaged with the built environment. What I would like to see is that people who are involved in making cities think of the profession that we follow as more like that of being doctors than being artists. And I want to explain to you what, it's not just a caprice of language, I'll just explain to you what I mean by that. I took, about 10 years ago, a group of my students at the London School of Economics to follow a group of junior doctors on their rounds. You know, this is where the young doctors see patients, and you know, there are older doctors accompanying them, and this group was. And you know, the patients were what patients are like in hospital. Many of them were in incredible pain, which they couldn't explain. They were sick from things they didn't understand, or they were indeed asleep. And the thing with these young doctors is that they had to somehow understand what they could do for these patients without being told by the patients what the patients needed or wanted. And that was part of the training of becoming a doctor. That's what that's involved with. And I asked my students from the LSE, well, what did you think of that? And they said, well, we can't do anything like that. You know, we can't act for people who are in pain without being given directions and to be their servants, rather than to engage in something which is a different form of social relationship. And that social relationship is one of care and of empathy for people who are not able to speak or coherently often for themselves. Furthermore, my students said, well, the thing about this is we're not really, we can't be like doctors because we're artists. And that's a completely different kind of craft or practice. I think where that comes from, that opposition of art to care, comes out of something that is a formation for this generation, which I find very disturbing, which is the relationship between being an artist, a designer artist, and monopoly capitalism. Because in the architecture world, with its Pritzker prizes, you know, all of that, it's gold medals of the Royal Society of Literature and so of architecture and so on. The notion is that there will be a few people who rise to the top, and that there'll be kind of dominant voices for what constitutes practice for the rest of the profession. That's exactly parallel to the careers of people in high tech, who gradually, they were creative, but gradually became monopolists. And as we know, we're living in the high tech world in an age of monopoly capitalism, very, very difficult for people who are not at the very top or in these very top organizations to survive. And to me, that seems to have infected a generation of people about what we should be doing as architects. Whereas to be a good doctor, you don't have to be a top doctor. You just have to practice well, and you've got to be in a relationship where you are meaningful to somebody else. And it would be very hard to argue that Jeff Bezos is meaningful in any, well, let's not go there. Anyhow, you get the point of this. What I think is that the whole practice of forming young designers has got to change its professional model, in which we don't make so much of a kind of revelatory or original aesthetic, but about something which cares for other people. This very interesting question about whether this is feminist or not for the first panel, I think has a kind of resonance for what I'm talking about. Of course, in the history of feminist thought, the notion of care and the re-examination of what caring meant was part of, at least in my generation of feminists, was very much on people's minds. I'm thinking of people like Juliet Mitchell, so on, Nancy Fraser. I would say that, in a way, what I'm talking about, you could call feminist. I'm not so happy with that quite, because I think that what's involved in a caring profession is also the ability to exert imagination, not just empathy, not feel good about somebody else, but to exert a kind of imagination about what it's like to be in a situation where other people are not in control of their lives and often not understanding what their lives are about. That is the medical situation. And it's not that the doctor is going to solve the problem. We hope it happens. But the attitude towards problem solving is that they have to do something to make the patient better. And I would say that that involves a degree of imagination in the built environment, which is not very provoking. Every time I go, Rahul and I teach together now at Harvard, whenever I go to one of these lectures where a top architect presents their work and so on, and the notion is, this is what you should be doing, I think that's not a way of encouraging young architects to care. They're going to need more imagination about problems which may be insoluble, just as, you know, patients die. So it's, what I want to, in sum, say to you about this is that I think we have to stop having biennales, of course, not this one or any of the ones within living memory, in which a practice is held up as a kind of dominant or hegemonic practice because it's the best. We need another way of understanding what it means to practice something which is more like the model that any good doctor would know. So those are my thoughts on that.
So what would you change in your classic architecture curriculum? Because I mean, you've written extensively how important it is to see, right? You've written a book called The Conscience of the Eye and many other things, where teaching someone to see, not to solve, completely changes the position of that object and what it stands for. Is that what's missing? I mean, Lesley, your exhibition allows us to see things of things we've been looking at and hadn't seen, right? I mean, I think that's very, very powerful. Is that what you're also getting at?
Sure.
What does that mean? No?
Sure. I mean, but the notion is not that the object that you're going to see is so striking that you see in a way you've never seen before. You have to learn to see with other people and to interrogate what you see rather than to be impressed by it.
Sorry, I was not talking about seeing as in, oh wow, that's a beautiful object.
Yeah.
It's, are you seeing the sort of granular, complex, difficult?
Yes, absolutely.
Ro, I know you think about this. You're allowed to talk.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. But you want me to comment on practice particularly, or just to generally? So look, I mean, first of all, I want to thank you all, and I just want to say that I think my perspective I bring, both being an educator and a practitioner, but I also want to state how blessed I am to have been part of 5 biennales, which have been incredible platforms actually to distill from a very context-specific set of findings to another platform which allows for exchange. And I think that's been part of the expansion, let's say, of what I see as practice. And I think I'm particularly grateful now to Lesley for having invited me for this, because it takes 20 years of retrospective views to come together. And thank you for mentioning the installation. So I want to actually try to put 3 or 4 points, seemingly unconnected but very connected, which might lead up to the idea of practice. One is, just listening to the conversation earlier, conversations we've had in the council. Today, the world is in flux, and it is really shifting around, right? Whether we talk about what's happening to Venice, the UNESCO kind of response to it, we talk about migration, that came up a lot, human flux. There has been a transformation in terms of technology and communication, digital flux, which is spawning new cultures. And climate change, I mean, is another form of flux, right? So it's transient. Everything that one listens to talks about a transience. And in education, we are yet fixated on absolute solutions. We haven't began to look from a pedagogical perspective in the training of the architect of how we design for transitions. That's a whole different design culture approach. It is about uncertainty. It's not linear. It's reiterative in a much more random way than design thinking as we see it. And I think this is going to be a fundamental challenge going forward. And I think the lab of the future, coupling decarbonization and decolonization, this is all part of rethinking how we deal with this sort of transience. Now, what that means, and again, an observation among the younger students I teach, I notice how our spheres, and I mean this all of us, our spheres of concern are exponentially expanding. I mean, we talk about everything. I mean, stuff we discussed in the last panel, what we talk about in the council, things that have been covered in this Biennale, goes from questions of equity to, gender, to, I mean, a whole lot of stuff. But our spheres of influence are diminishing exponentially. As I jokingly say to my students, we've now talked about climate change and everything it encompasses, and young architects, you're going to get up tomorrow morning and go and do an extension to your mom's best friend's kitchen, right? There's a big gap there. And I think for pedagogy, that's going to be critical.
Say a bit more about the scale of influence.
So, I mean, our spheres of concern are exponentially expanding, right? The discussions we have. And that's a very good thing, because we are challenging ourselves with many more issues which make our responses hopefully more nuanced. But in reality, what education prepares us for actually diminishes our sphere of influence. And you have to get a calibration, or you have to get in balance, I think, for another generation, for the future, our spheres of concern and our spheres of influence. And therefore, I think the way pedagogy is framed, that how you prepare students going out in the world to be able to do that, becomes critical. Otherwise, you're going to get cynics who are going to go into the world and ruin it, perhaps. And so I think pedagogy has to address that. And that's linked to practice. I think we should be focusing more on what is, not on the practice of architecture, but what is the architecture of practice. And I think that's where multiplicity, modes of engagement, again, things we heard about in the last panel, I think that's what one has tried to put forth in the installation, where pedagogy, research, advocacy and practice, they're linked, they're not separated. But how can we prepare a whole generation that can slide easily across those 4, because they inform each other. The advocacy gives you a pulse on the ground, the research informs you, researching, and practice, again, allows you to deploy and expand your spheres of influence. And so these are intrinsically interlinked. And in the business as usual pedagogy, we've sliced them, and we've specialized in each of these areas. And I think that's problematic and has a big impact on practice.
So you're both, to a degree, arguing certainly for a different paradigm of what architecture stands for, the architectural practice of architecture. But I still haven't understood whether you're also both suggesting a different way of actually organizing the 3-year, 5-year architecture curriculum, for example, or not. Because in a way, I think, Richard, you were being critical that the current standard architectural 5-year course, whether it's in Italy or the United States or whatever, absolutely does not fire the imagination.
Yeah, I am. I think the craft aspects of design practice are better learned on the job than in a school. And the practical aspects of it, and particularly with computers now, that's much easier. I'd like every beginning architect to take a course in philosophy, to learn things which are going to be critical to thinking about the practices that people inevitably learn in making a kitchen, you know? I'm just speaking personally about this. I just feel that the kinds of questions that are on young people's minds, which are good, are questions which the academy is not very responsive in helping them about. I'll give you one example of this. One of my students once asked me, well, what's a democratic window look like? Crazy question. It's, to me, a kind of fundamental question which she would never have answered at Harvard in the course of 3 years. And that's wrong.
I mean, one of the things that, Raoul, you've written a lot about, but your practice has also taken into account is time, right? I mean, you've written importantly about how cities are not one moment in time, that they change very, very dramatically. You defined it as the static and the kinetic. Maybe just talk a little bit about that. And, you know, if I reflect, there's no course in architecture where that is sort of dealt with, and it does fit into the wider discussions, you know, how do you measure society? What is meaning?
In fact, that was the provocation for the Biennale installation of 2016, which was, does permanence matter? And the provocation was that, are we making permanent solutions for temporary problems? And I think this goes back to the question of transience, which is, I think there's a kind of assumption in pedagogy, the way we train architects, that we're making things for permanence, and that's what leads us into absolute solutions. But if you embed time and temporal thinking, it opens up all sorts of possibilities, because it allows reversibility, it allows lightness, it's also linked to all the issues we're talking about to do with sustainability, climate change, all of that. But how, and that's what transitional thinking is about. It is about how one can move back, forth, sideways, within kind of a time imagination. And so this spatio-temporal dimension is something we've got to really seriously re-embed in our thinking about the environment more broadly.
Yeah, I wanted to pick that up in the context of working in Australia now. We are working at the university on indigenizing the curriculum, is how it's called. This may not be the right words, but those are the current working words. We're working in the context of Indigenous Australians, of course, and we're having a referendum in Australia on 14th of October about changing the constitution to recognize the traditional owners of the land were indeed the traditional owners of the land. We say it in every meeting. In any walk of life now, recognizing that, but it's not recognizing the Constitution. Only in 1969 were Indigenous Australians recognized in the census, as in counted as people in Australia. So this is what we're dealing with. The referendum has exposed, of course, a culture war, as these things are tending to these days, and there's every chance that there may be a no vote, which would set the country back decades, if not a lot longer, in my view. Referendum might be completely the wrong tool for this. We heard a lot about democracy in the previous panel, and I think there's every chance that electoral representative democracy is fundamentally flawed. Maybe that's another discussion, but citizen participation regarding citizens' assemblies would probably be a much better way of handling these complex challenges. Nonetheless, we're getting to this referendum. Indigenous Australians are about 3% of the population, so it's about 1 million people. But since the British invasion of Australia in 1788, it hasn't been understood that this is actually arguably the longest continuous civilization on the planet. So 70,000 years of continuous civilization across multiple nations within Australia. You can draw a line through this deep time, as it's called, in that sense. So they've seen multiple climate changes, actually, and been resilient through that. Far more successful than any Western civilization we might, not that it's a competition. But we're beginning to recognize now in Australia, we recognize these are the first architects, actually. These were the first scientists. The first bakers, as far as we know, are now beginning to emerge in Australia. The British denied all of this, and interestingly, they used architecture and property to do that. There was this idea that the architecture that Indigenous Australians had was just not recognized as British architecture, so it was denied as existing. It was called terra nullius, as in a blank land, a blank canvas, because they could recognize no trace. This was on purpose, of course, in order to steal the land. There was architecture in Australia that looked as it would be understood by a British architect, actually, but that was burnt down fairly quickly and then ignored. And the rest of the highly adaptive architecture was just not understood. And property rights, of course, were not understood in any European sense. They were understood in very different terms, and so that was denied as well. So Australians now, First Nations Australians, are the most incarcerated people on the planet. They're more likely to go to jail than any other people on Earth. They live about 10 years less on average than non-Indigenous Australians. So what we're beginning to do, though, is rethink, working with Indigenous colleagues, how do you approach this not from a social deficit position? So regarding the previous conversation, I think Claudia's amazingly motivating points about feminism, actually. But the Indigenous elders that we work with, like Uncle Paul Briggs, for instance, is talking about, we don't want handouts around this stuff. We want to recognize the patterns of culture that work within indigeneity and have done for many thousands of years. So they might be things like a relational, not a transactional way of working with the environment. So a reciprocal relationship with nature, a more than human understanding, recognizing in Indigenous Australian the word country with a capital C means all of the living things. Us, what we call nature in the West separated. They say, of course, that's a false separation. Rocks, trees, the landscape, everything is country in that sense. Nature-based infrastructures and technologies then are part of this, complex forms of value, adaptive architectures, biomaterials, this deep time thinking. How do you work with 7 generations in mind, not just one? And then a culture not based on ownership. So it's interesting, the UNESCO comment, because I recognize the question, of course, but it still feels an exploitative relationship with culture, which is we're demarcating it and putting a badge up on it, rightly or wrongly. So there are things there that then manifest themselves in actual techniques. How do you work with fire and flood, not as a threat, but something you work with as a material? So Indigenous Australians deliberately set fire to things in order that they don't turn into bushfires, wildfires. So the wildfires that we've seen in North America at the minute are a Western approach to understanding fire in the context of a fire. Indigenous Australians have never done that. They practice cool burns, which are managing through fire in a very different way. Flooding is, of course, moving nutrients around the soil in the right way. You know, its inundation is a highly positive thing. We turned that into a natural disaster by not understanding how to work with that as designers, planners, architects, politicians, whoever. And then finally, maybe one last example would be in the last big bushfires in 2019, when around 3 billion animals were killed or displaced in Australia. So this is the scale we deal with in Australia. It's the hottest, driest continent, and we're about to go into an El Nino phase again. So we're all kind of worried about this summer. 2019, these bushfires were so extraordinary, the smoke reached Argentina, you know, across the Pacific in that way. But what it also did was it burnt off some topsoil in Victoria, where I live, and revealed this eel farm that had been lying. It was being built into the landscape, shaped with stones in the middle of waterways, at least 6,000 years old, maybe 8,000 years old, probably older, as far as it's hard to tell. And it suddenly became visible on the surface again because those foliage was burnt away. And it rained. and it started working again. So it started catching eels, just the right amount, not too many eels so that the stocks were deplenished, but enough eels to work with. So this is a 6,000-year-old operating system that just rebooted like this. I mean, to your point, when Jeff Bezos makes anything this good, we should pay attention to him, but there's nothing working on that scale. So this is an entirely different, you can infer a different kind of architecture. This is what we're beginning to think about from these patterns of activity. I'm beginning to think, how do you overlay things like, when it comes to fire, drone technology and satellite mapping with indigenous cool burns at the same time? How do you understand the landscape in the way this is a nature-based technology but overlaid with contemporary technologies? Those all come back to this very reciprocal approach, care-based approach to working with environment, which is non-extractive, non-exploitative. That changes everything as far as we're concerned.
We might come back to a couple of the points you raised. I mean, the issues of nature, flows. I know that, Raoul, you're very interested in that as a generator, in fact, of form. Or Richard, your right concern with the climate change issue. Where does that actually fit into not just the education of the architect, but the shaping of architecture in cities? But I'll say that, that some of the concerns you've had or observations you've made as an anthropologist over the years is to identify very much excluded groups, no? And you're not a designer, but you're involved in designing an institution that is investigating race or investigating how to institute anti-racism. So maybe you would like to comment on some of these issues.
Yes, thank you. I thank you very much for the invitation to Lesley and Ricky and Mariana. It's a pleasure to be here and meeting my colleagues from the council. I would like to make a couple of comments, and probably the first one on picking out Dan's mention of indigenous people in Australia. And with the work that I'm currently doing at the UN and creating this office that is going to deal with racism and racial discrimination inside the organization. And being the United Nations, an international organization with such a diverse workforce, this should be something that we should have tackled many, many years ago. But better now than, never. But just to bring up this issue of the systemic nature of racism, that is really a system that has conditioned us to discriminate against others, and it's in such a way that perpetuates the way we relate to one another. In the ways it was put together to justify and legitimize slavery, colonization, the marginalization and even killings of indigenous populations. So the fact that you are looking into that in Australia and trying to look at not only what they represent, but what they bring in terms of contribution to the modern world, I think it's a very important one. But I would like to link that also to the issue of flux, of transitions, of liminal spaces, because I think it's not that we are in a flux right now. We have always been in a flux, and I think that's what conditions the way societies evolve. They evolve from the interstices, from the gray areas, from the twilight zones. And in the 5 minutes that I was given to prepare for this, I thought I would share with you my research with young people by focusing on 3 such liminal spaces and transitions and intersections of past and future or gray areas. And as you know, the African continent has a very young population. The average age of an African today is 18 years old. And this majority of the population is a population that has been very alienated from mainstream society, feels marginalized, disenfranchised. And I was looking at the transitions into adulthood and noticed that those transitions were very slow and very complex, that young people took a lot more time to attain the independence of adulthood. And so I came up with this idea, which is not my term, but is a term that was already there. But I kind of crystallized what I was finding in my research in South Africa, in Mozambique, in Senegal, in Tunisia, this idea of waithood. Waithood as this combination, a portmanteau of the word wait and the suffix hood. Just to give this idea of the stalling, of the waiting for this period that creates this kind of twilight zone, this space in which people struggle, but at the same time, it opens a lot of spaces for agency, for transformation, for change. And while some analysis has been looking at this as a kind of a dead space and a space in which people are doomed, my experiences in the field and engaging with these young people show that this was a very creative period for them. And I was talking to young Mozambicans in Portuguese, they would tell me, estou a desenrascar a vida. Desenrascar a vida meaning eking a living, or eking out a living. Or the Senegalese would tell me, oh, c'est la débrouillage, I'm making do. Or the South Africans would say, I'm just getting by, I'm just trying, thinking of today, tomorrow. And with a very interesting also way of mirroring this period, but from the point of view of the older generation, they would say, oh, this is the time of the youth men, this in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and the youth men meaning that these young people have not attained the social markers of adulthood. On the one hand, they are criticized by the older generation of not getting there, but on the other hand, they are doing the best they can to get there. And these young people are migrating and looking for opportunities and solutions. They leave the village to the city, the rural-urban migration, but they also leave the city in their home country to the city next door in another country. Often we look at international migration and the boats crossing the Mediterranean as if it was the entirety of the African migration, but it's really a tiny fraction, because the majority of the young people in the continent migrate within the continent, more than 85%. And so it is this exploration for new opportunities, for grabbing the opportunity. They are kinds of bricoleurs, kind of jacks of all trades, trying to seize these opportunities, being tactical, not often have the opportunity of being strategic about where they want to go. And I think that's the beauty, that's where we find the creativity, the improvisation, the make-do, and trying to kind of test the system, being in the interstices of right and wrong, true and false. Is this criminal, non-criminal? But they're pushing the boundaries. And they're pushing those boundaries in the informal sector. They're pushing those boundaries by being peddlers in the streets, being chased out by the police, and using that urban space that was not built for them, but they are negotiating their space there, being, cleaning cars in the middle of just a red light in this, and being chased by the police, or selling goods in the pavement, etc. So they are fighting with this environment, this physical space that didn't have them into account, and often is not thinking about them. So while the first liminal space was their own liminality, the second is the liminal space between them and the physical space they inhabit in. And it is in this kind of desenrascar, of making do, that some creativity is born out of these young people, and they kind of create some kind of consciousness about their own position, which brings me to the third liminality, which is this contestation, this protests. And as you know, since the Arab Spring and even before, we had the food riots and against neoliberal economics, and the cost of foodstuffs, etc. But also that young people started gaining a conscience that we are the ones that have to fend for ourselves. And this idea of contesting their own waithood and contesting the fact that they are in the margins, in the waiting room of modernity, and trying to negotiate a new space for themselves within the modern world. That's why the lights of the city become attractive. That's why when you had the riots in London in 2011, I think the killing of Mark Dugan, they went straight to the symbols of modernity, the Gucci stores, the Apple stores. They destroyed, because that's what was not available to them. And so it is this constant negotiation with the city environment that this generation is bringing, and also the fact that they occupy that space with a political protest. When they go and do the street demonstrations, the sit-ins that they say, you know, this is our space. Or even when they just sit and chat in a part of the street that they were not supposed to be there, and the police comes and chases them away, and a day later they're there, or the vendors, etc. But also in terms of their expressions of contestation, which is not just occupying the space by being there physically, but through their songs, the lyrics of their songs, the poems of their spoken words, the graffiti in the skins of the city, the theater performances, etc. They are claiming that space. And I think it is, in terms of education, in terms of governing and designing cities, I think it's time that we open up and we start looking and seeing beyond what we're seeing how these people want to live in those physical spaces, how architects, designers, planners should engage with those kinds of groups. Look, and you know, in a way it relates to what Claudia and others in the panel were talking about, the social aspects of being in that space. How do we make this kind of the care and creating space for this generation? And I think young people are fundamental. Ricky, I'll just finish now. Fundamental in the sense that if we talk about deracializing society, decarbonizing society, decolonizing society, they are in the forefront of this creating new futures. And following, you know, I've been doing research with youth social movements, the kinds of partnerships and alliances that they are now creating, because they're coming to the conclusion that they are not fighting against one leader or one political party. They're fighting against a system that goes beyond the boundaries of their own village, society, country, whatever. And so in that, I have seen young Africans creating alliances with the young diaspora, with other Africans of other peoples of African descent in India, or indigenous peoples in Australia, or in Latin America, etc. So there is this organization, Global Black Youth, that tries to bring them together. So there is interesting things going on there that we should open up to that group.
I mean, one of the core questions behind your observation seems to be, can one design cities in such a way that the practice you've described is not enabled? And I think probably the reality is for all of us, all 9 of us, in working in different parts of the world is that actually cities are being designed to stop some of these practices. And I know Richard and Raoul may have thought about, I mean, it does also take us away, Richard, from the object and the spaces in between. And how can you, I mean, when you say that there's a generation of hundreds of millions of people who can just make do, makes me think of your descriptions of the public spaces of Paris in the 18th century. I mean, it's and the ability of just being in a crowd, but feeling not alone, you know, and that dimension I think is significant. But we are designing spaces in cities which don't allow that to happen. Raoul.
Oh yeah, I mean, very quickly, absolutely what you're describing, and that's this is when architecture as the central spectacle of the city becomes a problem. The cities we are creating, I call it the architecture that manifests the impatience of capital, and that's what all our cities are about, because capital lands, it has to be realized, its brittle form happens very quickly, and so therefore we have to look for these alternate spectacles that are actually emerging organically out of the liminal spaces you're talking about. And so therefore, I think whether it's how we educate young people to pick up on this, or how we reimagine new aesthetics to how the city is represented, architecture is too much of the central spectacle, which is actually becoming limiting. And that's where it's at odds with, you know, everything you described.
Richard, do you want to add on this? Go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, one thing that's really striking to me about this description is where a kind of informal, geographically, where in a city an informal kind of habitation like this can occur. And we know in part the answer to that. It's places that other people don't want to be in. And I think the challenge to it, to me, is how to create that possibility for that informal space where you're mixed with somebody else who is not in that state of life. How do you have a space of cohabitation rather than a space which is you know, peripheralized, allowed to occur, but away from, you know, other ages, other races, and so on. I believe that informality of this sort can be designed, but I think and I've always believed this is what designers should do, is make spaces which people can take over. But it's not a simple thing of just doing nothing. There's a concrete set of practices that allow informalization of different groups to live together, and that's the challenge to me of what you're as a designer. What you're talking about.
Yeah, I wasn't, you know, I'm not thinking as a designer in terms of, but I'm just thinking about the concept of it.
Yeah.
In terms of saying, let's imagine the city in ways that are not so rigid. And so it's not creating a separate space for them to use.
Not at all.
They are already in the margins and they have those spaces. But could we think of our cities of the future differently because of these kinds of experiences?
And the answer is yes. We could.
Yes, but without kind of segregating them in corners around and maintaining what is...
Right. But all I'm saying to you is that's not a question of less design. That takes a set of principles of porosity, for instance, the edge of space is something that allows that to happen. It's not that the designer goes away, but that she or he or they is a different kind of way of seeing, to go back to your question. And it is a practice. It's not just simply letting it happen, because it won't happen if you just do that. You'll just get marginalization, you know, spaces which are away.
Yeah, this is really fundamental about this. I think it's actually more, it's more design. It's actual design, whereas previously it's been too easy to make separated things. It's and highly problematic. And as you pointed out, Raoul, it's fixed in people's minds as to what an architect might be as well. I know that our students, if I ask them who are you aspiring to being, I fear, many of them, and I literally mean I fear it, will say Zaha Hadid or Rim, or the sort of following the wasteful contrails of architects, so which I have no time for personally whatsoever. The other kind of design is much harder, which is how do we make a city as a place where you encounter strangers, people that are not like you, in a convivial way, and it still works. How do you make a place that people can adapt? How do you make a place, how do you make housing work in a way that we know we can't construct anymore? Actually, we just don't have the material budget on the planet to make the housing that we're currently scheduled to make. That's a huge challenge to us, far more complex as a question. And it really, we're working in this small country town now in regional Victoria, looking at social housing. To your point, Richard, it's social housing there is excluded from the places where people who currently run the town are. And to make it work in those environments, incredibly hard. That's where we're putting our students now to work in that town, systemically, working with people directly. And it's really a
just
different
one
architecture.
thing about this. The notion of waiting is itself something which is very much against the ethos of just being in a space. Is very much against the kind of ethos of people moving through space, that the space is something which is about mobility rather than habitation. That's a real conflict, and that's a conflict for designers. How to slow people up or how to make them not move at all. So I don't think it's an either or, but the waiting part of it for these young people is a challenge to the kind of normality of their practice, that space is something about movement. So the answer is that we should work together.
No, just very quickly, I mean, I think just to go back to the idea of temporal thinking, I think what you're describing, liminal spaces, softer uses in some ways, can easily be embedded in the hard city if one thinks on a temporal scale, right? Because places aren't used. And that's where I think that shift in thinking can allow this embedding and making the space in the way Richard's describing. It's not about the designer detaching, but actually engaging even more. And it's then the design of other systems which can enable that, which become really very critical.
I mean, I think the one thing which is being said here is that just space is not neutral. Yeah. And, you know, if Mariana had the microphone, she will probably in a moment. So, you know, how can we talk about this without talking about the political system that lies behind it? When in reality, the political system that is realizing the sort of spaces we're talking about are intentionally denying some of these practices to actually happen. So I think we'd like to ask a few questions from the floor and then come back and have some final reflections from the panel. So could we have the lights up? And again, same directions as Mariana, which is keep it short. Those of you who've asked questions, I'm not going to go to. No, not yet. We want different voices, different people, different generations, and then we'll come back. Un po' di luce, per favore, so that we can see the. Could we have some lights up? Thank you very much. Tell us who you are.
Hi, I'm Francesca. I'm a documentarist, and thank you for the amazing discussions we were having today. And I think in this panel there's a theme that thrown up that I also wanted to ask the panel before, and is this idea of doctors being able to analyze a need and answer a need, even if it's not really well expressed or rightly expressed, or expressed in a way that we are used to hear and learn and act through that. And I think this is very important because when we talk about participatory process, when you go in real terms, often it's like just a small part of the society that can be activated or connected in this participatory process, because there's the one that maybe has the knowledge or have found the thing online to go and talk about that. So I was interested in your point of view on how to somehow reach unheard parts of the society and embed these voices, also when maybe they're like conflictual or confrontational about the same idea of being made part of a political or designer or architectural process. I think this is very important in all our cities and experiences too.
So I'm sure. You want to come? There are two microphones there, yeah.
Well, thank you for this question. I mean, it's a kind of, what I'm thinking about is the notion that we put an incredible pressure on people to be able to communicate clearly, to say what they want, to know what's right for themselves, and so on. And just as a social thinker, I've never believed that that kind of verbality and self-representation is very realistic. Most of us are full of conflicts. We're often inchoate. We can't say what we really think, and so on. We all know this personally, but when we move to the social level, we begin to do a process of triage, so that people who are mute or people who are self-conflicting, who I wouldn't say sick, but people who are suffering from something, are sort of excluded from the picture because they're not communicating. So in my writing as an urbanist, I've been very interested. The reason I'm so interested in space is because I think there are ways of people communicating with each other and living with each other which are nonverbal, which don't put that pressure on people to be self-representative. It's why I'm very critical of a lot of community organizing, which demands that the community speak, that it clarifies what it wants to do. Behind this, if I could just say something, just one thing more about this, is the error that people Jürgen Habermas embodies, which is the notion that the more interaction people have, the more mutual clarity they come to. This is not true. We're too complex and too confused and oftentimes too oppressed to be able to come to something which is a common agreement. And that's the reality that I think all social action is based on, that we're not Enlightenment creatures. And that's why I think about this medical image, not the doctor as a curer, but the doctor who's trying to understand something which is obscure, which doesn't represent itself, or which has conflicting symptoms. That's the human condition.
Dan, briefly on this, and then another question.
Yeah, I think there's a participation itself we need to unpack a bit, and there's lots of different flavors of it, obviously. I mean, it's an important question you ask, but again, I mentioned things like citizens' assemblies work for certain kind of things, different types of participation for other things. We have very few of those things in practice, really, with cities, ultimately. We've either labeled it under electoral democracy or capital, who decides those things. So I think there's something in Richard's earlier point about how people can adapt places to their own living patterns as they evolve in complex ways. There are entire fields of architecture to do with that. John Herbrakken's work around that, John Turner's work. So that's fundamentally important, I think. That's genuine participation, making things happen. And then finally, the mode of architecture there is very different. It's more like, again, this general practitioner model, perhaps, and we don't really have those. We've been exploring at our school, at least. There's this work by Paul Falleros, who is an Australian architect who worked with indigenous communities again. He probably got through 15,000 people over the course of his career. It's more like a GP, where a general practitioner might see 7 or 8 people a day, right? You know, and each of them, they ideally help in some way. So imagine you have the community architect in that same way, the neighborhood architect. A good architect now, you're lucky if you make 20 buildings in your whole career, right? That's relatively successful. These community architects is seeing 20 people a day or 20 people a week perhaps, and it's a very different model. It's more tactical, engaged, embodied, embedded, grounded in that place, nudging and working with the communities in the complexity of their existing life. That isn't a model for architecture, again, that our students have in their heads when they join.
I think there's a question there and then over here. So 2 questions, thank you.
Yes, thank you. Well, thanks to both panels. They were really, really super interesting. And my name is Matilde and I'm a journalist. I wanted to ask you a little bit about, so before we briefly touched upon the climate change and how to interact as architects, as designers with the non-human. And I also really like this notion that it is difficult to come together as human beings through discussion and through rationalization often. So I was wondering whether there's, especially after this summer where we've seen so many weather conditions, so many tragic events with the climate, not that before we didn't have the problem, but I was wondering whether there could be an opportunity in coming together with the non-human that can push us together as human beings.
Raoul. Yes.
Well, yes. Yes. Oh, definitely. No, but I mean, I think that's a really good question, because I think extending our preview, extending our openness to imagine multi-species existence is absolutely critical, because, leave alone other species, sometimes people are designing without even imagining human beings in those buildings and environments. So I think multi-species thinking is going to be absolutely critical if you have to think more ecologically about the planet. And this goes all the way from the birds, and why can't we make spaces in buildings for birds to nest? You can create a whole ecology around that, right? There's just so many things one can think of in terms of having this coexistence. And to go to some of the examples that you were sort of sharing with us in the Australian case, those are cases in point where one can learn from indigenous practices around all these questions, but interface them with new technologies and the digital and drone technology you were talking about. So absolutely, yeah.
We have a PhD researcher who's designing skins for buildings kind of with habitats embedded in them. So it's looking at modeling how owls see the world and then reverse engineering how you create hollows inside buildings. It's called urban hollows. So those kinds of things are really fundamentally linked to us. As birds you mentioned, we know that if we decrease traffic noise, we increase bird song. If we increase bird song, our mental health improves, we recover from sickness quicker. We actually increase our life satisfaction more from hearing more bird song than an increase in your salary. So it's just, you sort of think, how are we organizing the world now? But it's absolutely true, yeah. No, so it's so fundamentally linked, but that research is not in the hands of any urban planner or urban designer who's modeling streets in Florence or Rome right now, I can tell you. So it's just, it opens up a way of thinking and working which is profoundly generative and interesting, but it means a complete reconfiguration of the way we work in silos currently.
Thank you. I just wanted also to add something about this in relation to thinking about architects and designers also being, having to react to the changes that nature and those other groups are creating. Because one of the things that I've seen with the young people is that although they feel marginalized, they are also already transforming those societies. There is this interesting work on cemetery cities that was done in Congo, in which a cemetery was closed and people wanted to build, they didn't know where to go. They started taking over that space. or people who build without good planning and design, and then we need to catch up with them. So not all of it starts on the side, but it's also how do we adjust and react. And I think it was also Claudia who was mentioning in the panel before how the city had to accommodate and, you know, and say, this is the city we are. And rather than thinking of the rightly planned city, you know, for example, when are our slums going to become cities? We have more slums in Africa than cement cities, but we continue to refer to the city as the city of cement, and the rest is the slum. You know, those kinds of thinking in terms of what a city is, who is serving, what is formal, what is informal. I can see in cities like Maputo, for example, in Mozambique, where the mayor is mainly the mayor of the city of cement, because they say, oh, the slums, it's very confusing, there's no structure, we don't know how to deal with. And so, you know, kind of rethinking and changing the way we look at future cities and
No, I completely agree with what you're saying, and I think partly because we are addressing education. I think it's critical to understand, unfortunately, that what we might call, I mean, all the examples you're giving, I use this word hesitatingly, but I can't think of an alternate, the global south or other parts of the world. You know, we are perpetuating the theories that came out of the industrializing West from the previous century, and those become the lenses through which we imagine what a city should be. And I think the real challenge, and you're absolutely right, whether it's the liminal spaces, whether it's looking at multi-species existence, how does one construct new frameworks that begin to account for the accelerated flux, the liminality, architecture not being the central spectacle of the city. In those economies, what is the aesthetic of incrementalism? Because otherwise we have preconceptions and we judge it by that. And that is a huge problem within the academy.
And this is why, I mean, Claudia's, seemingly modest reference to Planterrazas, which is going to be published and illustrated in one of our publications, is profound, actually, in terms of what it does. These tiny interventions, retrofitting, making human condition possible, or more possible, is incredibly powerful. And one must add to that the carbon argument. It is no longer acceptable to demolish stuff, right? Even though I think Naples has just received several $100 million pounds from central government reconstruction fund to demolish buildings and rebuild. In some cases, you need to do that. But, and I think this is where the arguments of, the right to the dwelling and the right to the city really come together. And the Barcelona example, again, on the front cover of this, is not just using imagination, it's using the city as a place of habitation. Now, we have one more question over there, and then Lesley, you may want to comment. I don't know.
Yeah, my name is Ole Moistad. I'm a professor of urbanism in Norway. And I want to thank, this has been before and after experience. So thank you, Mariana Mazzucato and everybody. It's incredible what you have been getting together here, Lesley Lokko and everybody. So, I
thought that was the question.
That was the beginning. One thing that struck me now, it's beautiful to land on this question of, okay, so what about the future? What about the city in the future? What about the education in the future? What do we need to know? What do we need? What skills do we need? One of the mayors, I'm afraid I couldn't pick which one of you, but said very clearly that you have a strong experience of being faced with a city which is planned and with the tools that are generated out of a world that doesn't exist anymore. So what do we do now? My own first step on the academic ladder, my first job was I was teaching at the American University in Beirut just after the Civil War. And that gave me a very strong experience of the absence of permanence. Because it had, I could talk for a long time about this, but I'll get to the point. The thing is that you have to deal with a city center where I found myself very often in front of buildings that had been shot to pieces, then squatted in, repaired, shot to pieces, repaired, and you couldn't make out whether this building is going up or coming down. So the experience, which I think comes back now very strongly, is that change is the new permanence. And plans and sections are not well fit to deal with that. And Raul Merotra,
can I respond to your question? Or to your...
I just wanted to pinpoint Raul Merotra. You pointed out this, the loop of experience, doing stuff, using it, and then redoing it. And this is a learning loop, no? And
let's have just a few words from the panel, and then can you pass the microphone to Lesley?
Yeah,
okay. Yeah. Raul, Richard, briefly.
This is a wonderful observation. I want to talk to you about Beirut later because I worked on its reconstruction. So, but anyhow, one of the tools that I found very useful to myself in thinking about this is open systems theory, which is about unpredictable results and displaced unforeseen consequences and so on. And we're living that with climate change. We know what the end is going to be like, but the process of climate change is an open system. And I've been teaching this to our students at Harvard, how to, instead of thinking linearly about from where we are now to where we're going to be, how this erratic, open system, path-dependent kind of world works. We know how it works mathematically, but we're now living it socially as well. So that's I think, one clue.
Raul?
Yeah, just a very quick interjection, which is that, I don't think it's a matter of debunking permanence completely. I think it's how we make these two conditions coexist. They actually depend and feed off each other. They set the background for each other. And I think permanence and stability psychologically is something which I think buildings also play an important role on. And so therefore, I think it's not one or the other. We have to be careful how we calibrate that juxtapositioning of what might be the temporary or how we use productively the temporal in these imaginations of the city.
I mean, Alcindor, your term weighthood captures everything in describing action. Yes. Dan, very quickly.
Yeah, I think, again, from this sense of a circular process, indigenous Australians, again, it's a circular sense of time. It's not linear in that at all. But then the city does come back to then these shifting layers of change. And some things are slower and some things are faster, obviously. So, and there is a value to the slowness. And maybe this is what you're saying about the permanence as well. So if we make a grand civic building like a public library, and we do that with care and we maintain that well, and that's 250 years old, that stands for something about what a society thinks about knowledge or wisdom or learning or exchanging. And that's its value, is its slowness and its near permanence. It's not really permanent, but it's effectively permanent for generations who live through that, and it's still there. The rest of the city can be moving like this, and that's its permanence. It's a fast layer of change. So it's constantly understanding these different layers of change shearing against each other in complex ways as open or complex adaptive systems. But you're right, maybe it's, we can't assume we have the constant flux, of course. There's just many different speeds moving at different points.
And even the notion of transitions, it's not either having absolute solutions or transitions, but sometimes several transitions occur simultaneously. My colleague Yves Blau talks about this, that you transition out of one condition into another, and what might be the end condition would be something completely different. And so the simultaneity of transitions is, I think, another way of describing what you've just said.
I think it's amazing that so many of you are still here after a number of hours of conversation. So I think I would like to bring this to an end, and in a moment we will thank these panelists and the ones we've had before. We mentioned throughout the conversation that the Council on Urban Initiatives has published a number of things, including a paper, working paper by Mariana and another colleague, Leilani Farah, on the right to the city. We're now, the right to housing, I'm sorry. And we're also working on a series of these, let's call it models, positive models, represented by the mayors here, all of whom, I assure you, understand the impermanence much better than any of us. That's what they deal with on a daily basis. But before we complete, I'd like Lesley to perhaps make a few observations.
I hope it's on, yeah. A couple of things. One is, you know, when I started the introduction, I said there's something about the quick-fire, quick-witted exchange of ideas that is like nothing else, and I think this afternoon for me has certainly been that. There's a quote in the exhibition that's about epistemology, like what is epistemology? What is it to know the world? And part of it is to know the world through your own eyes, but also through the eyes of others. And every time I come away from these conversations, there are words that appear almost like gold nuggets. And the idea of waithood for me is exactly one of those. I think education, because this is the bit that the panel has been talking about, is in a state of waithood. The original title for the exhibition was Africa is the Laboratory of the Future, because so many of the conditions that we find there demand a different way of thinking. In a sense, Africa is in a perpetual state of waithood. And I think our systems are slowly catching up to the fact that many of the answers, not necessarily concrete answers, but many of the intimations or the hints or the intuitions about the way to go next can already be found there. And I'm going to wrap this up by saying that actually the Zulu term for an architect, which is a magician of space, but it is also the maker of a sensation and the maker of a situation, 3 definitions of the word architect, for me is a really profound way to think about not the professionalization of the architect, which is partly the way we teach it, but actually the profound epistemology of the word. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for staying so long, and thank you to these 2 absolutely amazing panels. Obrigado.